At exactly 8:47 a.m. on a frozen Tuesday morning, Mason Reed stood in a stairwell between the 42nd and 43rd floors of a Manhattan skyscraper, holding evidence that could save $90 million or cost him the only stable job he'd had in 3 years. The woman blocking his path was Victoria Hale, CEO of Sterling Crown Capital, the same person who'd humiliated him in front of 12 executives less than 24 hours earlier. She had 17 minutes before the market opened. He had one chance to make her listen. That's how a single father serving coffee became the only person standing between a financial empire and total collapse. I'm inviting you to follow this story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The alarm clock screamed at 4:47 a.m., 3 minutes earlier than Mason had set it. He slammed his palm down on the plastic casing, silencing the piercing beep before it could wake Ellie in the next room. The apartment was cold. It was always cold in February. No matter how high he cranked the ancient radiator that clanked and hissed like a dying animal throughout the night. Mason sat up slowly, his back protesting the movement. The futon he slept on had seen better days, probably sometime during the Clinton administration, based on the way the springs dug into his spine. He rubbed his eyes and stared at the ceiling where a water stain had spread into the shape of something that looked vaguely like a map of Florida. He'd been meaning to call the super about that for 8 months. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person to stand in comfortably. Mason filled the coffee maker with water from the tap, counting the seconds it took to reach the 4-cup line. 14 seconds. Same as yesterday. Same as the day before that. Routine was everything now. Routine kept the bills paid. Routine kept Ellie fed and clothed and safe. While the coffee brewed, he pulled eggs from the refrigerator and set a pan on the stove. The gas ignited with a soft whoosh, blue flames licking the bottom of the scratched Teflon. He cracked 2 eggs into a bowl, one for Ellie, one for him, and whisked them with a fork that had 3 slightly bent tines. "Daddy?" Ellie's voice came from the doorway, small and sleep-thick. She stood there in her pink pajamas with the unicorns on them, her dark hair sticking up in 17 different directions, clutching the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 2. "Hey, sweetheart, you're up early." Mason kept his voice quiet, gentle. He glanced at the microwave clock. 5:03 a.m. I had a dream about Mom again. Mason's hand froze halfway to the refrigerator handle. He turned to look at his daughter, really look at her, and saw the way she was biting her lower lip the same way Sarah used to when she was trying not to cry. He crossed the small kitchen in 2 steps and knelt down in front of Ellie, putting them at eye level. "Good dream or sad dream?" "Good. We were at the park, the one with the blue swings." Ellie's eyes were dark like his, but her face was all Sarah, the shape of her nose, the way her eyebrows curved. "She was pushing me really high. I could almost touch the clouds." Mason pulled her into a hug, feeling her small arms wrap around his neck. "That sounds like a really good dream." "I miss her." "I know, baby. I miss her too." They stood like that for a long moment, father and daughter holding each other in a kitchen that smelled like cheap coffee and tomorrow's problems. Finally, Mason pulled back and brushed the hair out of Ellie's eyes. "You want to help me make breakfast?" Ellie nodded, and just like that, the moment passed. She climbed onto the step stool next to the stove, and Mason handed her the spatula. Together they scrambled the eggs, while the winter morning stayed dark outside their window. By 6:15 they were both dressed. Mason wore his usual uniform, dark jeans, a white button-down shirt that was starting to fray at the collar, and the navy blue apron he'd carry to work. Ellie had on her school clothes, a purple sweater and jeans that were getting a little too short. He'd need to buy her new ones soon. Add it to the list. The subway station at 74th Street was already crowded with early morning commuters. Mason held Ellie's hand tightly as they descended the stairs, navigating around a man selling stolen Metro cards and a woman preaching about the end times to anyone who'd listen. The platform smelled like urine and brake dust, and something else Mason couldn't quite identify and didn't want to think about too hard. The E-train arrived 4 minutes late, packed with bodies pressed against bodies. Mason lifted Ellie up so she wouldn't get crushed, letting her sit on his hip even though she was really getting too big for it. She rested her head against his shoulder, still half asleep. "Tell me a math story," she murmured. Mason smiled. This was their routine, their thing. "Okay, let's see. There were 7 apples in a basket. He made up a simple word problem, nothing too complex, just enough to keep her mind engaged during the 40-minute commute. Ellie loved numbers. She got that from him, the same way she got her stubbornness and her inability to leave a puzzle unsolved. Sometimes that scared him, the idea that she might want to follow in his footsteps, might want to enter the world that had chewed him up and spit him out. They got off at Lexington Avenue and walked 3 blocks to Ellie's school. PS 234 was a squat brick building that looked like every other public school in New York City, overcrowded, underfunded, doing its best with what it had. Mason walked Ellie right to the door of her classroom, where Mrs. Patterson was already setting up for the day. "Morning, Mr. Reed." Mrs. Patterson was probably in her 50s, with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She was good to Ellie, patient with her when the other kids didn't understand why she'd rather solve multiplication problems than play 4 square at recess. "Morning, Mrs. Patterson." Mason knelt down and helped Ellie out of her backpack. "You have everything? Lunch? Homework?" "Yes, Daddy." Ellie rolled her eyes the way 7-year-olds do when their parents ask obvious questions. "Okay, I'll see you at 3 o'clock, right here." "I know." "I love you, Ellie Belly." "Love you too." She hugged him quickly, then ran into the classroom without looking back. Mason watched her go, felt that familiar ache in his chest that never quite went away. She was growing up too fast. They always did. The Sterling Crown Capitol building was on Park Avenue, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that rose 67 floors into the Manhattan sky. Mason had been working there for 14 months, ever since he'd answered an ad for a hospitality services position that required no financial experience and asked no questions about employment gaps. He entered through the service entrance on 52nd Street, swiping his ID badge and nodding to Carl, the security guard who'd worked the morning shift for the past 20 years. "Cold one today?" Carl said, same as he said every winter morning. "Sure is," Mason replied, same as he replied every time. The service elevator took him to the 3rd floor, where the employee break room and kitchen facilities were located. Mason stored his jacket in his locker and tied on his apron. The coffee station was his domain. He kept it stocked, kept it clean, kept the executives caffeinated and happy so they could make their million-dollar decisions without having to think about something as mundane as whether there was half and half in the refrigerator. He started the first pot of coffee at 7:30 a.m. sharp. By 7:45, he had 3 different varieties brewing, regular, dark roast, and decaf that nobody ever drank, but he had to make anyway because it was in the hospitality services manual. He arranged the cups, the stirs, the little packets of sugar and artificial sweetener in precise rows. Everything in its place. The executives started arriving around 8. Mason recognized most of them by now, even if they didn't recognize him. There was Judith Chen, head of equity trading, who took her coffee black and always looked like she'd slept about 3 hours. David Kowalski from mergers and acquisitions, who dumped so much cream and sugar in his coffee that it barely qualified as coffee anymore. Patricia Levin, who ran the legal department and had never once made eye contact with Mason in 14 months. They came, they took their coffee, they left. Mason was furniture. Mason was wallpaper. Mason was the invisible man who kept the caffeine flowing. At 9:17 a.m., Mason was wiping down the counter when he heard raised voices from down the hallway. He glanced up but didn't stop working. Raised voices were common on the 3rd floor. This was a high-stakes environment where people made and lost fortunes before lunch. Stress was the baseline. But something about these voices made him pause. "Absolutely insane if you think I'm signing off on this. The models all check out, Victoria. We've run them 6 different ways. Then run them a 7th time because these numbers don't make sense." The voices were getting closer. Mason focused on his cleaning, keeping his head down, but his ears were fully engaged now. He couldn't help it. Old habits. Victoria Hale swept past the coffee station like a Category 5 hurricane. She was 30 years old and looked younger, with sharp features and dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had probably started the day neat, but was now coming loose. She wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Mason's monthly rent, and an expression that could cut glass. Behind her came 3 men in their 40s and 50s, all of them carrying tablets and looking various shades of concerned. "The algorithm has been tested for 6 months," one of them was saying. His name was Richard something. Mason couldn't remember his last name, but he was Senior Vice President of Quantitative Trading. "We've accounted for every variable." "Have you?" Victoria stopped so abruptly that Richard almost walked into her. She spun around, and Mason found himself with an inadvertent front row seat to the confrontation. Have you accounted for February volatility? Have you accounted for the fact that the Fed is meeting in 3 weeks and everybody knows they're going to adjust rates, but nobody knows by how much? The algorithm adjusts for volatility. Does it adjust for uncertainty? Because that's what we're dealing with here, Richard. Uncertainty. Victoria's voice was sharp, precise, the voice of someone who'd learned to command rooms full of men twice her age. I'm not risking this firm's capital on a model that might work. With respect, Victoria, if we wait much longer, we're going to miss the opportunity window entirely. Then we miss it. She turned and continued down the hallway toward the conference room. I'd rather miss an opportunity than step on a landmine. Set up another meeting for Thursday. I want to see revised models that account for all possible scenarios, not just the ones that make us money. The men followed her, still protesting, their voices fading as they disappeared around the corner. Mason stood there with his cleaning cloth in his hand, frowning. Something about that conversation bothered him. Not the conflict itself, that was normal, but the specific things Victoria had said. February volatility, Fed rate adjustments, algorithmic trading models that supposedly accounted for every variable. He shook his head and went back to cleaning. It wasn't his business. It hadn't been his business for 3 years, and that's exactly how he wanted to keep it. He had a daughter to pick up at 3 o'clock. That's what mattered. At 11:30, Mason restocked the coffee station and took his lunch break in the employee cafeteria on the basement level. He ate the sandwich he'd packed that morning, turkey and cheese on wheat bread, and scrolled through his phone, checking to make sure there were no messages from Ellie's school. No news was good news. He was back at his station by 12:15, just in time for the lunch rush. More executives, more coffee, more conversations he wasn't supposed to hear but couldn't help overhearing because the coffee station was positioned right outside the main conference room. At 2:47 p.m., Mason was preparing to leave for the day when Thomas Wu from IT Services stopped by the coffee station. Hey man, you got any of that dark roast left? Just made a fresh pot. Mason poured him a cup. You're a lifesaver. Thomas took the cup and dumped 3 sugars into it. Big meeting going on in there. Everybody's been running around like crazy all afternoon. Yeah? Mason kept his voice neutral, disinterested. Some new trading algorithm they're rolling out. Supposed to make the company like $50 million in the first quarter alone. Thomas whistled low. Way above my pay grade, that's for sure. Mason handed Thomas a stir. Sounds complicated. Everything these people do is complicated. That's why they make the big bucks and we make the less big bucks. Thomas laughed at his own joke, then headed back toward the elevators. Mason started cleaning up for the day, but his mind was elsewhere. Trading algorithm, $50 million in the first quarter, Fed rate adjustments, February volatility. Stop it, he told himself. Not your problem. Not your world anymore. He untied his apron, folded it neatly, and stored it in his locker. He was halfway to the elevator when he heard Victoria's voice again, this time from inside the conference room. The door was partially open. Final review tomorrow morning, and then we go live on Wednesday. Richard, I want you to personally oversee the first trading session. If anything looks off, anything at all, you shut it down immediately. Clear? Crystal clear. Good. Let's break for today. Everybody go home, get some sleep, and we'll reconvene at 7 a.m. sharp. Mason should have kept walking. He should have gone straight to the elevator, taken the subway to 74th Street, and picked up his daughter like he did every single day. He should have gone home and made dinner and helped Ellie with her homework and tucked her into bed and never thought about Sterling Crown Capital's trading algorithm again. But he didn't. Instead, he found himself standing outside the conference room, watching through the partially open door as the executives filed out. The room was empty now except for one person, a young analyst who was collecting papers and stacking them on the table. The presentation was still up on the screen at the far end of the room, showing a series of charts and graphs and columns of numbers. Mason's eyes caught on the numbers. He told himself to look away. He told himself it wasn't his concern. He told himself all the things he'd been telling himself for 3 years. But he was already reading the data on the screen, his brain automatically processing the risk metrics and volatility calculations and correlation coefficients. He couldn't stop himself any more than he could stop breathing. And that's when he saw it. It was small, incredibly small. The kind of thing that 99 out of 100 analysts would miss because it was buried 3 layers deep in the model assumptions. But Mason had spent 7 years as a risk analyst before Sarah died. 7 years learning to spot the things other people missed. 7 years developing an instinct for danger that he'd never quite managed to turn off, no matter how hard he tried. There was an error in the correlation matrix, a single transposed variable that fundamentally altered how the algorithm would respond to market stress. Under normal conditions, the error wouldn't matter. The algorithm would work exactly as designed. But under stress conditions, the kind of stress conditions that happened when volatility spiked in February, or when the Fed made unexpected rate adjustments, the error would cause the algorithm to do the opposite of what it was designed to do. Instead of reducing risk, it would amplify it. Instead of protecting the firm's capital, it would chase losses, doubling down on failing positions in a desperate attempt to recover. Mason stared at the screen, his heart rate increasing. It would trigger a cascade, a chain reaction. The algorithm would lose money, try to recover, lose more money, try harder to recover, lose even more money. Within hours, maybe minutes, it would consume the firm's entire risk allocation for the quarter, $90 million. Maybe more. Can I help you? Mason jerked his attention away from the screen. The young analyst was looking at him with a mixture of confusion and irritation. Sorry, I was just... Mason gestured vaguely. Coffee station. Wanted to make sure everyone was done for the day. The analyst glanced at Mason's civilian clothes, clearly registering that he wasn't in his work apron. We're done. You can clean up whenever. Right. Thanks. Mason backed away from the door, his mind racing. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, torn. Then he checked his phone. 2:53 p.m. He had 7 minutes to catch the subway if he wanted to be at Ellie's school on time. Mason headed for the elevator. On the subway ride to Queens, Mason tried to focus on anything except the numbers spinning through his head. He read the advertisements for personal injury lawyers and English language courses. He counted the stops. He watched a teenager doing tricks with a soccer ball at the far end of the car. But the numbers wouldn't leave him alone. The transposed variable, the correlation error, the cascade effect. $90 million, maybe more, gone in a matter of hours. Not your problem, he reminded himself. You gave that up. You chose this life. He made it to PS 234 with 3 minutes to spare. Ellie came running out at exactly 3 o'clock, her backpack bouncing, her face bright with the kind of excitement only 7-year-olds can manage on a Tuesday afternoon. Daddy, guess what? I got 100 on my math test, look! She thrust a paper at him with a big red 100% written at the top. Mason took the paper and made a show of examining it carefully. Wow. Multiplication tables through 12, that's my girl. Mrs. Patterson said I'm the only one in the class who got them all right. Ellie was practically vibrating with pride. That's because you're brilliant. Mason folded the test and handed it back to her. We'll put this on the fridge when we get home. They walked to the subway station hand in hand, Ellie chattering about her day, how Jeremy had gotten in trouble for putting glue in Madison's hair, how they'd read a story about penguins in Antarctica, how she'd traded her apple slices for Emma's cookies at lunch. Mason made the appropriate noises at the appropriate times, but part of his brain was still in that conference room, still staring at those numbers on the screen. Back at the apartment, Mason made dinner while Ellie did her homework at the kitchen table. Spaghetti with jarred sauce, nothing fancy, but Ellie ate 2 helpings and that's all that mattered. After dinner, they watched an episode of a nature documentary about the ocean. Ellie was fascinated by octopuses, the way they could change colors and squeeze through tiny spaces. Mason sat next to her on the futon, half watching the screen, half lost in thought. At 8 o'clock, he tucked Ellie into bed. Her room was barely big enough for the twin bed and small dresser, but she'd decorated it with drawings she'd made at school and a poster of the solar system that Mason had bought her for her birthday. Daddy? Ellie's voice was sleepy. Yeah, sweetheart? Are you okay? You've been quiet today. Mason sat on the edge of her bed and brushed the hair back from her forehead. I'm fine. Just thinking about work stuff. Coffee stuff? Yeah, coffee stuff. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. Get some sleep. I love you. Love you too. Mason turned off the light and pulled the door mostly closed, leaving it open just a crack the way Ellie liked it. Then he stood in the narrow hallway between their two rooms and made a decision he knew he was going to regret. He went to the kitchen and pulled out his old spiral notebook from the drawer where he kept the bills and takeout menus. The notebook was from before, from his Wall Street days, filled with calculations and risk models and the kind of mathematical thinking he'd promised himself he'd left behind. Mason sat down at the kitchen table and opened the notebook to a fresh page. Then he started rebuilding Sterling Crown Capital's algorithm from memory. It took him 4 hours. 4 hours of filling page after page with equations and variables and probability distributions. 4 hours of double-checking his work, triple-checking it, running the numbers forward and backward until he was absolutely certain he hadn't made a mistake. By the time he was finished, it was nearly midnight, and the conclusion was unavoidable. The algorithm was going to fail. Not might fail, going to fail. And when it did, it was going to take Sterling Crown Capital down with it. $90 million in losses, maybe more. Enough to trigger regulatory investigations, investor panic, maybe even bankruptcy depending on the firm's cash reserves. And it was going to happen tomorrow, Wednesday, the day they were planning to go live. Mason stared at the notebook, at the pages of calculations that proved beyond any doubt that he was right, and everyone at Sterling Crown Capital was wrong. Then he picked up his phone. He didn't have Victoria Hale's number. He didn't have any of the executives' numbers. But he had the main switchboard for Sterling Crown Capital, and after midnight it would route to the emergency line for senior staff. The phone rang 4 times before someone picked up. Sterling Crown Capital Emergency Services. I need to speak to Victoria Hale, CEO. It's urgent. Ma'am is not available at this hour. If you'd like to leave a message, this is about the trading algorithm going live tomorrow. There's an error, a critical error. If you don't shut it down, the company is going to lose $90 million. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sir, I'm going to need your name and employee ID number. Mason hesitated. The smart thing to do would be to hang up. The smart thing would be to delete this call from his phone's history and pretend he'd never made it. He'd done his due diligence. He'd tried to warn them. Whatever happened next wasn't his responsibility. But he thought about the people who worked at Sterling Crown Capital. Not the executives. They'd be fine. They always landed on their feet. But people like Carl, the security guard. People like the cafeteria workers and the cleaning staff and the other people in hospitality services who couldn't afford to lose their jobs when the company imploded. My name is Mason Reed, he said quietly. Employee ID 4471. I work at the coffee station on the 3rd floor. Another pause, longer this time. Mr. Reed, I'm going to transfer you to the executive crisis line. Please hold. Elevator music filled Mason's ear. He sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by pages of calculations, and waited. The music cut off abruptly. This is Victoria Hale. Her voice was clipped, irritated, the voice of someone who'd been woken up at midnight by an emergency call. Who is this and what's this about my algorithm? Mason took a deep breath. Ms. Hale, my name is Mason Reed. I work at your coffee station. This afternoon, I saw the presentation for your new trading algorithm, and there's an error. A correlation matrix error that's going to cause catastrophic losses when the market becomes volatile. Silence on the other end of the line. Then, you're the coffee guy? Yes, ma'am. And you're calling me at midnight to tell me there's an error in an algorithm designed by some of the best quantitative analysts in the industry? Yes, ma'am. Based on what? A presentation you glimpsed for 30 seconds while you were cleaning up? Mason heard the skepticism in her voice, the thinly veiled contempt. He understood it. From her perspective, this was insane. The coffee guy calling the CEO at midnight to question millions of dollars worth of quantitative analysis. I know how this sounds, Mason said carefully, but I used to be a risk analyst. Before I came to Sterling Crown, I worked at Lehman Brothers, then Goldman Sachs, then as an independent consultant for hedge funds. I specialized in algorithmic risk assessment. And I'm telling you, there's a transposed variable in your correlation matrix that's going to trigger a cascade failure the first time the algorithm encounters market stress. Another silence, longer this time. If you were such a hotshot analyst, why are you making coffee? It was the question Mason had been dreading, the question he'd known she'd ask. Personal reasons, he said quietly. Family reasons. But that doesn't change the mathematics, Ms. Hale. The error is real, and if you go live tomorrow, you're going to regret it. He heard Victoria let out a long breath. I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Reed. I've had about 4 hours of sleep in the past 2 days. I have 15 different fires burning that all need to be put out before the market opens. And you're asking me to shut down a major initiative based on a phone call from a hospitality services employee who may or may not have the qualifications he claims to have. I understand, but however, Victoria continued, cutting him off, I didn't build this company by ignoring potential problems, no matter where they come from. Can you be here at 6 a.m. before the rest of the team arrives? Mason thought about Ellie, still asleep in the next room, thought about their morning routine, the breakfast he needed to make, the subway ride to her school. I can be there at 6:30, he said. I need to drop my daughter off at school first. 6:30 then. Come to the executive floor, 62nd. Tell security I authorized it. Victoria's voice softened just slightly. And Mr. Reed, if this turns out to be nothing, if you're wasting my time, you're going to be looking for a new job by 7 a.m. Are we clear? Crystal clear? Good. See you in the morning. The line went dead. Mason set his phone down on the table and stared at his notebook. He'd just potentially ended his career at Sterling Crown Capital. He'd just risked the stability he'd built so carefully over the past 3 years, all for a company that barely acknowledged his existence. But he'd done the right thing. He was almost certain he'd done the right thing. He just hoped he hadn't made a terrible mistake. Mason didn't sleep. He lay on the futon staring at the water stain on the ceiling, watching the numbers replay in his head like a stock ticker he couldn't turn off. At 4:30 a.m., he gave up pretending and got out of bed. The apartment was darker than usual, the street light outside their window having burned out sometime during the night. Mason moved through the kitchen by memory, filling the coffee maker, cracking eggs into the pan. His hands shook slightly as he whisked them. Exhaustion, probably. Or fear. Hard to tell the difference anymore. Ellie shuffled in at 5:15, earlier than normal. You're making a lot of noise, she said, rubbing her eyes. Sorry, baby. Didn't mean to wake you. She climbed onto the step stool and watched him cook, the way she always did. You look tired. Yeah, well, didn't sleep great. Mason poured the eggs onto 2 plates. Big day at work. Coffee stuff? Mason managed a smile. Something like that. They ate in silence, just the scrape of forks on plates and the distant sound of garbage trucks rumbling down the street. Ellie kept looking at him with those dark eyes that saw too much, understood too much for a 7-year-old. Are we okay? She asked finally. The question hit Mason harder than it should have. Yeah, sweetheart. We're okay. Why do you ask? Ellie shrugged, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate. You just seem worried, like when the rent was late that time. Mason set down his fork. The rent's not late. We're fine on money. I promise. Then what are you worried about? How did you explain to a 7-year-old that her father was about to walk into a building full of people who'd either think he was crazy or think he was trying to sabotage them? How did you explain that he was risking the only stable job he'd had in 3 years because he couldn't ignore a mathematical error that might cost strangers $90 million? Just some work stuff I need to figure out, Mason said. Nothing for you to worry about. Ellie didn't look convinced, but she went back to eating. They left the apartment at 5:50, earlier than usual. The subway platform was less crowded at this hour, populated mostly by overnight shift workers heading home and early morning janitors heading to office buildings in Manhattan. Mason and Ellie found seats on the E train, and Ellie leaned against his shoulder, half asleep again. Mason pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app where he'd photographed the pages from his spiral notebook. The calculation stared back at him, undeniable. The transposed variable was in cell D47 of the correlation matrix, a single flipped coefficient that would cause the algorithm to interpret negative correlation as positive correlation under stress conditions. It was the kind of mistake that happened when someone copied data from one spreadsheet to another without double-checking the cell references. Catastrophically simple, catastrophically expensive. The train lurched to a stop at Lexington Avenue. Mason pocketed his phone and took Ellie's hand. PS 234 didn't officially open until 7 a.m., but there was an early drop-off program for parents who had to be at work before then. Mason signed Ellie in at the front desk, where a tired-looking woman named Angela sat with a coffee and a romance novel. You're early today, Angela said, marking Ellie's name on the roster. Yeah, got some stuff to take care of. Mason knelt down and gave Ellie a hug. Be good today, okay? I'm always good. I know you are. He pulled back and looked at her seriously. Listen, if I'm a few minutes late picking you up this afternoon, don't worry. I'll be here, I promise. Ellie frowned. You're never late. I won't be late today either. I'm just saying, if I am, it's okay. Okay. She hugged him again, quick and tight, then ran off toward the cafeteria where the early morning kids waited until their classrooms opened. Mason stood there for a moment watching her go. Then he checked his phone. 6:07 a.m. He had 23 minutes to get to Park Avenue. The subway back to Manhattan felt slower than usual, every stop taking twice as long as it should. Mason stood by the door, gripping the pole, mentally rehearsing what he'd say to Victoria. He needed to be clear, concise, credible. He needed to make her understand the severity of the error without sounding like he was overselling it. Most of all, he needed to not sound crazy. Sterling Crown Capital looked different at 6:20 in the morning. The lobby was nearly empty, just a few security guards and early arriving executives getting their caffeine fix at the Starbucks on the ground floor. Mason bypassed the service entrance and headed straight for the main elevators, his heart hammering. The security guard at the desk, not Carl, someone younger Mason didn't recognize, looked up as he approached. Help you? Mason Reed. Ms. Hale authorized me to come up to the executive floor. Mason kept his voice steady, professional. The guard checked his computer, frowning. Your hospitality services. Yes. And you're going to the 62nd floor. That's right. The guard picked up his phone and dialed. Yeah, this is lobby security. I've got a Mason Reed here saying he's cleared for executive floor access. A pause. Uh-huh. Okay. Thanks. He hung up and gestured toward the elevators. You're good to go, 62. Mason nodded and walked to the elevator bank, acutely aware of how out of place he looked. He wasn't wearing his apron, he'd left it in his locker, but he was still in his usual work clothes, cheap and worn compared to the tailored suits that normally occupied these elevators. The ride to the 62nd floor took less than a minute, but felt like an hour. Mason watched the numbers climb, his stomach sinking with each floor. What the hell was he doing? This was insane. Victoria was going to take one look at him, realize he was wasting her time, and fire him on the spot. The elevator doors opened onto a reception area that made the third floor look like a janitor's closet. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, modern art on the walls that probably cost more than Mason made in a year. A receptionist's desk that was currently empty. Mr. Reed, Mason turned. Victoria Hale stood in a doorway to his left, looking exactly as exhausted as she'd sounded on the phone. She wore black slacks and a white blouse, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. No makeup, dark circles under her eyes. Ms. Hale, thank you for seeing me. Don't thank me yet. She gestured for him to follow her. We've got about 15 minutes before my team starts arriving, so let's make this quick. She led him down a hallway into a conference room that was smaller than the one on the third floor, but significantly nicer. A long table, leather chairs, a massive screen on the far wall. Victoria closed the door behind them and turned to face Mason. Okay, you've got my attention. Show me what you're talking about. Mason pulled out his phone and brought up the photos of his calculations. The error is in the correlation matrix, cell D47. There's a transposed variable that flips the algorithm's interpretation of negative correlation under stress conditions. Victoria took the phone and scrolled through the images, her expression unreadable. You wrote all this last night? Yes, ma'am. I rebuilt your algorithm from what I saw in the presentation and ran it forward under various market conditions. The error doesn't show up under normal volatility, but when stress increases, it chases losses instead of limiting them. Victoria looked up from the phone, and for the first time, Mason saw something other than skepticism in her eyes. Concern, maybe, or fear. You're saying this would trigger a cascade. That's exactly what I'm saying. Once it starts losing money, it'll try to recover by taking bigger positions. Those positions will lose money, so it'll take even bigger positions. Within hours, you could be down your entire quarterly risk allocation. Victoria handed the phone back and sat down in one of the leather chairs, rubbing her temples. 90 million. Potentially more, depending on how fast you catch it. Jesus. She was quiet for a moment, staring at the table. Then she looked up at Mason. Why didn't you say something yesterday when you saw the presentation? Mason had been expecting this question, but he still didn't have a good answer. I wasn't sure at first. It's not my job to. I'm not supposed to. You're not supposed to what? Notice when my company's about to light $90 million on fire? I'm not supposed to be looking at executive presentations while I'm cleaning coffee stations. Mason met her eyes. And I definitely wasn't sure you'd listen to the coffee guy telling you your analysts were wrong. Victoria let out a short, humorless laugh. You're probably right about that. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city beginning to wake up below them. So you went home, rebuilt the entire algorithm from memory, verified your theory, and called me at midnight. Yes, ma'am. That's either really dedicated or really stupid. Probably both. She turned back to him. These calculations you did, how certain are you? Mason didn't hesitate. Completely certain. The math doesn't lie, Ms. Hale. That variable is transposed, and it's going to destroy you the first time the market gets volatile. Which in February, with the Fed meeting coming up, could be today, could be tomorrow, could be next week. But it'll happen. Victoria checked her watch. My team arrives at 7. Richard Wu is going to be here first. He's the one who designed the algorithm. I want you to show him exactly what you showed me. Mason's stomach dropped. Ms. Hale, with all due respect, I don't think that's a good idea. Your analysts aren't going to want to hear from the coffee guy. I know. Victoria's expression hardened. But right now, I don't care what they want to hear. If there's even a chance you're right, I need to know before we go live. So you're going to explain this to Richard, and he's going to check your work, and we're going to figure out whether we have a problem. And if he doesn't believe me, then I'll make him believe you. She walked to the door and opened it. Come on, Richard's probably already here. He basically lives in this building. Mason followed her back down the hallway, past the empty reception desk, to another office with glass walls and a view that probably cost extra. Inside, a man in his mid-50s sat at a desk covered in monitors, typing rapidly on a keyboard. He looked up as Victoria knocked on the open door. Victoria, you're here early. Richard Wu had the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who'd been wearing the same clothes for more than 24 hours. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, and there was a coffee stain on his shirt that he either hadn't noticed or didn't care about. We need to talk about the algorithm. Victoria stepped into the office, and Mason reluctantly followed. This is Mason Reed. He works in hospitality services. He's also, apparently, a former risk analyst who thinks he found an error in your correlation matrix. Richard's eyes flicked to Mason, taking in his cheap clothes and nervous posture. The skepticism on his face was immediate and absolute. I'm sorry, what? Cell D47, Mason said quietly. There's a transposed variable. Under stress conditions, it'll cause the algorithm to amplify risk instead of limiting it. Richard stared at him for a long moment, then looked at Victoria. Is this a joke? Do I look like I'm joking? Victoria's voice was cold. He called me at midnight with a full mathematical analysis. I want you to check his work. Victoria, we've been testing this algorithm for 6 months. We've run it through every possible scenario. Then one more won't hurt. Victoria cut him off. Show him your calculations, Mr. Reed. Mason pulled out his phone again, his hands shaking slightly. He brought up the photos and handed the phone to Richard, who took it like it might be contaminated. Richard scrolled through the images, his frown deepening. He zoomed in on one page, then another, then went back to the first page. His expression shifted from skepticism to confusion to something that looked uncomfortably like alarm. Where did you get our model specifications? Richard's voice was tight. I didn't. I rebuilt it from what I saw in yesterday's presentation. You rebuilt a 6-month development project from a 30-second glance at a presentation. I've done this kind of work before. It's not that complicated once you understand the underlying assumptions. Richard looked up from the phone, his face red. Not that complicated? Do you have any idea how many man-hours went into building this? Richard! Victoria's voice cut through the rising anger. Is he right or not? The question hung in the air. Richard looked back down at the phone, scrolling through the calculations again. Mason watched him, saw the exact moment when the doubt crept in. It was subtle, a slight tightening around the eyes, a pause in the scrolling. I need to check the actual model, Richard said finally. These calculations are based on assumptions that might not, so check it. Victoria crossed her arms. Right now. We've got 90 minutes before the market opens, and if there's a problem, I want to know about it immediately. Richard set Mason's phone down on his desk and turned to his computer, pulling up spreadsheets and code windows. His fingers flew across the keyboard, and Mason saw him navigate to a file labeled correlation underscore matrix underscore final underscore v6 dot xlsx. The spreadsheet filled one of Richard's monitors, hundreds of rows and columns of data. Richard scrolled down, 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 until he reached row 47. Then he scrolled right until he hit column D. He stopped. Mason saw at the same moment Richard did. The value in cell D47 was negative where it should have been positive. A single minus sign that reversed the entire relationship between two variables. "Oh, fuck," Richard said quietly. Victoria stepped closer to the monitor. "Is that what I think it is?" Richard didn't answer. He was already opening another window, running the algorithm forward with the corrected value. Mason watched the numbers cascade across the screen, saw the model's output shift dramatically. "How did this happen?" Victoria's voice was dangerously calm. Richard ran his hands through his hair. "We must have transposed it when we migrated the data from the testing environment. I checked this matrix myself. I know I checked it. You checked it wrong." Victoria turned to Mason. "How much time before this would have triggered?" Mason thought about the market conditions, the upcoming Fed meeting, the general February volatility. "Hard to say exactly, but based on current indicators, I'd guess sometime in the next 3 to 5 trading days." "And the losses?" 90 million minimum, possibly more if it took you a while to realize what was happening. Victoria was quiet for a moment, her jaw tight. Then she turned back to Richard. "Call everyone. I want the entire development team here in 30 minutes. We're not going live today." "Victoria, if we delay, we miss the—" "I don't care what we miss." Her voice was steel. "We're not launching an algorithm that could bankrupt this company. Make the calls, Richard." Richard looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Victoria's expression stopped him. He picked up his phone and started dialing. Victoria gestured for Mason to follow her back out into the hallway. Once they were alone, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. "You just saved this company $90 million, she said quietly. "I just did the math." "No." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "You did more than that. You could have walked away. You could have kept your head down and let us fail, but you didn't." Mason didn't know what to say to that. He stood there awkwardly, very aware that he was still supposed to be the coffee guy, and she was still the CEO, and this entire situation was surreal. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said. "Why did you leave risk analysis? You're clearly good at it." Mason had known this question was coming too. He'd been dreading it since the phone call last night. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said simply. "Car accident. I had a 7-year-old daughter and a career that required 80-hour weeks. I couldn't do both, so I chose her." Victoria's expression softened. "I'm sorry." "Yeah, me too." Mason checked his phone. "Is there anything else you need from me? I have to be at my daughter's school at 3 o'clock. "What's her name?" "Ellie. And you're raising her alone." "That's right." Victoria studied him for a long moment. "What time do you need to leave to pick her up?" 2:30, 2:45 at the latest." She nodded slowly like she was working through a calculation in her head. "Mr. Reed, how would you feel about consulting for Sterling Crown on a part-time basis? We could work around your schedule with your daughter. You'd review our risk models, spot-check our algorithms, provide analysis when we need it." Mason blinked. "Miss Hale, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not—" "You just caught an error that 6 months of testing missed. An error that would have cost us 9 figures. Victoria pushed off the wall and faced him directly. "I'd be an idiot not to use that skill set, and whatever else I am, I'm not an idiot. I already have a job here. You'd keep that job. This would be additional work, additional pay." She named a number that made Mason's head spin. 10 hours a week, 15 max. Flexible schedule. You can do most of it from home. Mason thought about his rent, currently 2 months behind despite what he'd told Ellie. Thought about the holes in Ellie's shoes that he'd been meaning to fix. Thought about the fact that his futon was literally held together with duct tape and hope. "I don't have the credentials anymore," he said. "I let my certifications lapse. I'm not registered with—" "I don't care about credentials. I care about results." Victoria pulled out her phone. "Think about it, but think fast because I'm about to go into a meeting where I have to explain to my entire development team why we're delaying a major launch because the coffee guy found their mistake." Mason almost smiled at that. How are you going to handle that? Very carefully. She started walking toward the conference room. You might want to make yourself scarce. Richard's going to be embarrassed, and embarrassed people tend to get defensive. Ms. Hale? She stopped and turned back. Thank you, Mason said, for listening. I know how crazy this looked. Victoria shook her head. You know what's crazy? Dismissing someone because of their job title instead of their competence. I almost made that mistake. She glanced at her watch. Go on. Get out of here before the others arrive. I'll call you this afternoon about the consulting work. Mason took the elevator back down to the 3rd floor, his mind reeling. He retrieved his apron from his locker and started setting up the coffee station on autopilot, his hands going through the familiar motions while his brain tried to process what had just happened. He'd saved the company. Victoria Hale, the CEO of Sterling Crown Capital, had just offered him a consulting position that would pay more in 10 hours than he currently made in a month. And he'd done it all without missing a single morning with Ellie. The executives started arriving at their usual time, grabbing their usual coffee, making their usual small talk that didn't include him. Mason poured and cleaned and restocked, invisible again. But something had shifted. He could feel it. At 11 o'clock, Mason's phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. Meeting pushed to 2 o'clock, fixing the algorithm. You were right about everything. VH. Mason stared at the message for a long moment, then slipped his phone back into his pocket. At 2:30, he left Sterling Crown Capital and took the subway back to Queens. He was at PS 234 at 2:57, 3 minutes early, waiting outside Ellie's classroom when she came running out. Daddy! She crashed into him, backpack flying. Guess what? We learned about whales today. Did you know blue whales can weigh as much as 30 elephants? I did not know that. Mason took her backpack and slung it over his shoulder. That's pretty amazing. They walked to the subway station, Ellie chattering about blue whales and humpback whales and orcas that weren't technically whales at all, but were actually dolphins. Mason listened, asked questions, smiled at her enthusiasm. His phone buzzed again as they waited on the platform. Algorithm fixed. Crisis averted. Team wants to know how the coffee guy knew what we didn't. Told them you're not the coffee guy anymore. Expect a call tomorrow about the consulting work. Seriously, thank you. VH. Mason read the message twice, then looked down at Ellie, who was trying to estimate how many elephants would fit on the subway platform. Hey, Ellie Belly? Yeah? What would you think if Daddy did some extra work from home sometimes? Math work. Nothing that would change our schedule. Ellie considered this seriously. Would you still pick me up from school? Every single day, 3 o'clock sharp. Would we still have pancakes on Saturday? Obviously. Then, okay. She went back to her elephant calculations. Mason smiled and pulled her closer as the train arrived. The doors opened and they stepped inside, finding seats near the back. Tomorrow he'd worry about the details. Tomorrow he'd figure out how to be a consultant and a coffee station attendant and a single father all at the same time. Tomorrow he'd deal with the fact that he'd just stepped back into a world he'd spent 3 years avoiding. But tonight, he'd make spaghetti for dinner and help Ellie with her homework and tuck her into bed at 8 o'clock sharp. Tonight, everything was exactly the way it was supposed to be. The call came at 9:47 the next morning while Mason was refilling the cream dispensers. He almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, and he'd learned over the years that unknown numbers usually meant debt collectors or telemarketers, or occasionally his landlord asking about rent that was already on its way. But something made him swipe to accept. This is Mason. Mr. Reed, it's Patricia Levin, legal department at Sterling Crown. The voice was crisp, businesslike, the same woman who'd never made eye contact with him in 14 months. Ms. Hale asked me to draw up a consulting agreement for you. Do you have time to go over the details? Mason glanced around the coffee station. The morning rush was over and the 3rd floor was relatively quiet. Sure, yeah, now works. Excellent. I'm emailing you the contract now. The rate is $1,500 per billable hour, 10-hour minimum per month, 20-hour maximum. You'll maintain your current position in hospitality services at your current salary. The consulting work is entirely separate and can be performed remotely on your own schedule, provided you meet the monthly minimum and remain available for emergency consultations. Mason's brain stuttered on the number, $1,500 per hour. 10 hours minimum meant $15,000 a month. Before taxes, sure, but still. That was more than he currently made in 4 months. Mr. Reed, are you still there? Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm here. Mason tried to make his voice sound normal, like people offered him $1,500 an hour all the time. That sounds fine. Good. You'll need to come up to legal this afternoon to sign the paperwork. We'll also need your tax information, direct deposit details, and a brief employment history. Standard procedure. The employment history part made Mason's stomach clench. How detailed does the employment history need to be? There was a pause on the other end. Ms. Hale mentioned you might have some gaps. For our purposes, we just need to verify your analytical credentials. Previous employers in the financial sector, dates of employment, general responsibilities. We're not conducting a background check beyond the standard criminal and credit review. Criminal would be fine. Credit would be embarrassing but not disqualifying. Okay, what time this afternoon? 3:30 work for you? Mason thought about Ellie, about the promise he'd made to always be there at 3 o'clock. I need to pick up my daughter from school at 3. Could we do 4:30? Another pause, shorter this time. 4:30 is fine. 61st floor, Suite C. Ask for me at reception. Thank you, Ms. Levin. Thank you, Mr. Reed. What you did yesterday, that was impressive. The line went dead before Mason could figure out how to respond to that. He stood there holding his phone, staring at the coffee station that suddenly felt very small and very far away from wherever his life was apparently heading. A maintenance worker walked by and grabbed a cup of regular, didn't say thank you, didn't even look at him. Business as usual. Mason's phone buzzed again. An email from Patricia Levin with a PDF attachment. He opened it and scrolled through page after page of legal language that basically confirmed what she'd said on the phone. $1,500 per hour, flexible schedule, confidentiality agreements, non-compete clauses that wouldn't matter because he had no intention of working anywhere else. At the bottom of the contract was a section titled Scope of Work. Mason skimmed it, his eyes catching on phrases like algorithmic risk assessment, portfolio stress testing, quantitative model validation. All the things he used to do, all the things he'd convinced himself he was done with. He closed the email and pocketed his phone. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of coffee and half-heard conversations. Mason went through the motions, but his mind was elsewhere, running calculations that had nothing to do with caffeine ratios. $15,000 a month meant he could pay off his back rent in 2 months, could buy Ellie new shoes, new clothes that actually fit, could maybe even start saving again, building something that looked like financial security, could maybe breathe for the first time in 3 years. At 2:30, Mason cleaned up the coffee station and headed for the subway. The afternoon routine was sacred, non-negotiable, but today it felt different. Today he wasn't just the single dad picking up his kid. Today, he was also apparently a consultant for one of Manhattan's major financial firms. He still wasn't entirely sure how that had happened. Ellie was waiting outside her classroom at 2:58, talking animatedly with another girl about something involving science fair projects and volcanoes. She waved goodbye to her friend and ran over to Mason. Can we make a volcano for the science fair? Emma's making one and it sounds really cool. We can definitely make a volcano. Mason took her backpack. When's the science fair? Not until April, but Emma said we should start planning now because her brother waited until the last minute and his volcano didn't even erupt. It just kind of fizzled and made a mess. They walked toward the subway, Ellie describing in elaborate detail exactly what kind of volcano she wanted to make and how big the eruption should be. Mason listened, asked questions, tried to remember if he had any idea how to actually build a functional volcano. Hey, Ellie, I need to stop by my office for a little while this afternoon, just to sign some papers. You okay with that? Ellie looked up at him suspiciously. What kind of papers? Boring adult papers, work stuff. Can I bring my homework? Yeah, absolutely. We'll find you a place to work while I'm in the meeting. They took the subway back to Manhattan, Ellie sitting next to him with her math workbook open, occasionally asking him to check her multiplication problems. Mason helped her while simultaneously trying not to think too hard about the fact that he was about to sign a contract that would fundamentally change their financial situation. Sterling Crown Capital looked different in the late afternoon light. The lobby was less crowded, the Starbucks line shorter. Mason held Ellie's hand as they crossed to the main elevators. You work here? Ellie looked around at the marble floors and expensive art with wide eyes. This is fancy. Yeah, it's pretty fancy. Where's your coffee station? Third floor. But we're going to the 61st floor today. Ellie's eyes got wider. That's really high up. The elevator ride made Ellie's ears pop. She held her nose and blew the way Mason had taught her, giggling when her ears finally cleared. When the doors opened on 61, she stepped out cautiously, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows and the view of Manhattan spreading out below them. Whoa. Yeah, whoa is right. Mason approached the reception desk, where a woman in her 30s sat typing on a computer. Hi, I'm Mason Reed. I have a 4:30 appointment with Patricia Levin. The receptionist smiled at him, then looked down at Ellie. And who's this? I'm Ellie. I'm 7. We're going to make a volcano for science fair. The receptionist's smile widened. That sounds exciting. Miss Levin's office is down the hall, third door on the right. You can head back. Mason thanked her and led Ellie down the hallway. The offices here were all glass-walled, and through them Mason could see people having meetings, making phone calls, staring at multiple computer screens. Ellie gripped his hand tighter. Daddy, everyone here looks really serious. They're just working, sweetheart. Same as anywhere else. Patricia Levin's office was at the end of the hall, slightly larger than the others, and decorated with diplomas from Harvard and Columbia Law. Patricia herself stood up from behind her desk when Mason knocked on the open door. Mr. Reed, right on time. She looked down at Ellie. And you brought a friend. This is my daughter, Ellie. I hope it's okay that I brought her. Of course. Patricia gestured to a small table in the corner of her office where a few chairs sat around a coffee table. Ellie, there's some paper and pens over there if you want to draw while your dad and I talk. This shouldn't take too long. Ellie looked at Mason, who nodded. She went to the table and started pulling out her homework, settling in with the focused determination she applied to everything. Patricia closed the door and returned to her desk, pulling out a folder. I have the contract here, along with the tax forms and direct deposit paperwork. I'll walk you through each section. For the next 20 minutes, Patricia explained every clause, every contingency, every legal term that Mason barely understood. He signed where she indicated, initialed where necessary, provided his banking information and social security number, and employment history that looked more like a confession than a resume. Lehman Brothers 2005 to 2008, Patricia read from the form Mason had filled out. Goldman Sachs 2008 to 2010, Independent Consulting 2010 to 2014. She looked up. That's when your wife passed? 2014, yeah. I'm sorry. Patricia made a note on the form. And then you worked at 3 different hospitality positions before coming to Sterling Crown in 2015? That's right. Patricia set down her pen and looked at him directly. Mr. Reed, you went from being a senior risk analyst at Goldman Sachs to serving coffee. That's quite a transition. Mason glanced over at Ellie, who was deeply absorbed in her math homework. I had priorities that mattered more than my career. And now? Now I still have those priorities. But this consulting work, it doesn't interfere with them. That's the only reason I'm signing. Patricia nodded slowly, like she understood something she hadn't before. Ms. Hale mentioned that you have a hard stop at 3 o'clock every day. Non-negotiable. She said that too. Patricia gathered the signed papers and tucked them back into the folder. You know, I've worked at Sterling Crown for 6 years. I've never seen Victoria accommodate someone's schedule the way she's accommodating yours. I didn't ask her to. I know, that's probably why she's doing it. Patricia stood and extended her hand. Welcome to the team, Mr. Reed. Your first consulting retainer will be deposited on the 1st of next month. In the meantime, Victoria wants to set up a meeting next week to discuss your initial projects. Mason shook her hand, still trying to wrap his head around the fact that this was real. He was really doing this. One more thing, Patricia said as Mason turned to collect Ellie. The development team, Richard's team, they're not happy about what happened yesterday. Mason stopped. I figured. Richard Wu is brilliant, but he doesn't handle being wrong very well, and you made him look bad in front of Victoria. Patricia's expression was carefully neutral. I'm not saying there will be problems. I'm just saying you should be aware that not everyone is thrilled about the coffee guy becoming a consultant. Noted. Mason thanked her again and gathered Ellie, who carefully packed up her homework and waved goodbye to Patricia on their way out. In the elevator, Ellie looked up at him. Did you get a new job? Sort of. It's complicated. Are you still going to make coffee? Yeah, I'm still doing that too. Ellie frowned, processing this. That's a lot of jobs. Yeah, baby, it is. They had dinner at a diner near their apartment, a rare extravagance that Mason justified by reminding himself that he'd just signed a contract worth $15,000 a month. Ellie ordered a grilled cheese and chocolate milk and told him more about the volcano she wanted to build. Mason ordered a burger he barely tasted and tried to figure out how he was going to balance everything he'd just agreed to. That night, after Ellie was asleep, Mason sat at the kitchen table with his spiral notebook and started making lists. He'd need to set up a proper workspace at home, somewhere he could review risk models without Ellie accidentally seeing confidential financial data. He'd need to figure out which hours he could realistically dedicate to consulting without sacrificing time with his daughter. He'd need to remember how to be the analyst he used to be, the one who could spot patterns and calculate risk and see problems before they became catastrophes. He'd spent 3 years trying to forget how to be that person. Now he was being paid to remember. His phone buzzed at 10:15. A text from Victoria Hale. Patricia said you signed. Good. First assignment? Review the corrected algorithm before we go live next week. I'll send you the files tomorrow. Also, about yesterday's meeting, some of the team is resistant to outside consultation. Ignore them. You work for me, not them. Mason typed back, understood. Thank you for the opportunity. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Thank you for saving my company. Get some sleep. You're going to need it. Mason set down his phone and looked around the tiny kitchen with its chipped counters and flickering overhead light. In a few months, he'd be able to afford a better place. Somewhere with enough room for Ellie to have a proper bedroom, maybe even a small office where he could work without spreading papers all over the kitchen table. But moving would mean a new school for Ellie, a new routine, new uncertainties. And routine was everything. Routine kept them stable. He'd figure it out. He always did. The next morning, Mason arrived at Sterling Crown at his usual time and set up the coffee station like he had every morning for 14 months. He made the regular, the dark roast, the decaf nobody drank. He arranged the cups and stirs and sugar packets in their precise rows. But when Richard Wu came through at 8:15 to get his coffee, he didn't make eye contact, just grabbed his cup and walked away without a word. Judith Chen from Equity Trading was next. She at least nodded at Mason, but her smile was tight, professional, the kind of smile you gave to someone you were required to be polite to, but didn't particularly like. David Kowalski stopped at the station and actually spoke. Heard you're doing some consulting work now. That's right. Must be nice. Getting paid twice for the same job. Mason kept his expression neutral. I'm still here every morning making coffee, same as always. David dumped cream into his cup without measuring. Yeah, we'll see how long that lasts. He walked away and Mason stood there feeling the weight of every eye in the hallway. News traveled fast in this building. The coffee guy who'd caught the air Richard Wu missed. The coffee guy who was now making consultant money to do the job Richard's entire team was supposed to do. The coffee guy who didn't know his place. Mason finished his shift at 2:30 and picked up Ellie at the usual time. On the subway ride home, he checked his email and found a message from Victoria with 3 attachments: the corrected algorithm, the original algorithm, and a summary of the changes Richard's team had made. Review both versions, Victoria had written. I want to know if there are any other problems we missed. No deadline, but sooner is better than later. Mason opened the files on his phone and immediately regretted it. The algorithm was hundreds of lines of code, complex enough that reviewing it properly would take hours, maybe days. He couldn't do this on a phone screen while riding the subway with his daughter, asking him questions about volcanoes. At home, after dinner and homework and the bedtime routine, Mason opened his laptop at the kitchen table and pulled up the files again. The corrected algorithm loaded slowly, the code filling his screen in neat, organized blocks. He started at the top and worked his way down, checking each function, each variable, each calculation against his memory of how risk algorithms were supposed to work. By midnight, he'd found 3 potential issues. Not errors exactly, but inefficiencies that would slow down the algorithm's processing time and potentially cause lag during high-volume trading periods. He documented each one in a separate email to Victoria, explaining the problem and suggesting fixes. He sent the email at 12:47 a.m. and immediately regretted it. Victoria was probably asleep. Sending work emails at 1 in the morning made him look desperate, overeager, like he was trying too hard to prove himself. His phone buzzed 30 seconds later. Got your email? This is excellent work. Can you have the full review done by Friday? Mason typed back, yes. Good. Also, stop second-guessing yourself. I asked for this review because I trust your judgment. The fact that you're doing it at 1 a.m. just proves I was right to hire you. Mason smiled despite himself and set down his phone. Thursday morning, Richard Wu was waiting at the coffee station when Mason arrived at 7:30. We need to talk, Richard said without preamble. Mason set down his bag and started the first pot of coffee. Okay. What about? About the fact that you're reviewing my work. Work that my team spent 6 months developing. Work that Victoria apparently doesn't trust anymore because the coffee guy found one mistake. Mason measured coffee grounds into the filter, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. It wasn't one mistake. It was a critical error that would have cost the company $90 million. It was a transposition error that happened during data migration. It happens. We would have caught it during the first live trading session. Maybe. Or maybe you would have caught it after you'd already lost $50 million. Richard's face flushed. You know what your problem is? You think you're smarter than everyone else. You think because you used to work at Goldman Sachs, that makes you better than the people who are actually doing the work now. Mason turned to face him directly. I don't think I'm smarter than anyone. I think I caught an error because I was looking at your algorithm from a different angle than you were. That's all. That's all, Richard laughed, bitter and sharp. You humiliated me in front of Victoria. You made my entire team look incompetent, and now you're being paid consultant rates to double-check our work like we're children who can't be trusted. I'm being paid to provide risk analysis. That's what I'm doing. You're being paid because Victoria feels guilty about how she treated you. This is charity, Mason. Don't pretend it's anything else. The words hit harder than Mason expected. He stood there holding the coffee scoop, trying to figure out how to respond. But Richard wasn't done. You want to know what I think? I think you got lucky. You saw something in a presentation that happened to be wrong, and you're riding that luck as far as it'll take you. But sooner or later, Victoria's going to realize that you're not some genius analyst. You're just a guy who used to be good at his job before life beat it out of him. Richard grabbed his coffee, which he'd apparently poured himself while Mason wasn't paying attention, and walked away. Mason stood there for a long moment, the coffee station suddenly feeling like enemy territory. Then he finished setting up and went through the rest of his shift on autopilot. At 11:30, during his lunch break, Mason got another text from Victoria. Richard came to my office this morning, said you two had words. Want to tell me your side? Mason typed out 3 different responses and deleted them all. Finally, he settled on, he's upset about the consulting arrangement. I understand why. Do you want me to talk to him? No, it's fine. We'll work it out. Mason, if he's making your job difficult, it's fine. Really? There was a long pause before Victoria's next message came through. Okay, but the offer stands. Nobody gets to make your life hell because they're embarrassed about missing an error. That includes Richard. Mason pocketed his phone and finished his sandwich alone in the basement cafeteria, surrounded by other low-level employees who didn't know or care that he was now making consultant money. Friday afternoon, Mason finished his full review of the algorithm and sent it to Victoria at 2:15, just before leaving to pick up Ellie. He'd found 7 issues total, 3 he'd already reported, plus 4 more ranging from minor inefficiencies to one potentially serious vulnerability in how the algorithm handled sudden market reversals. Victoria called him at 8:30 that night, after Ellie was asleep. I just finished reading your review, she said without preamble. This is exactly what we needed. Half of these issues I don't think we ever would have caught on our own. Some of them are pretty subtle. That's why I hired you. Victoria paused, and Mason heard papers rustling in the background. I'm sending this to Richard's team on Monday. They're going to need to make corrections before we can go live. They're not going to be happy about that. I don't pay them to be happy. I pay them to build algorithms that work. Victoria's voice softened slightly. How are you holding up? Richard said some pretty harsh things yesterday. Word travels fast. It's a small building, and Richard has a big mouth when he's angry. Another pause. For what it's worth, he's wrong. This isn't charity, and you're not lucky. You're good at what you do, and you earned this position. Mason didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Listen, Victoria continued, I'm having a strategy meeting on Tuesday morning, 9 a.m., executive conference room. I want you there. I'll be running the coffee station at 9 a.m. Not on Tuesday. On Tuesday, you'll be in the meeting. I'll have someone else cover the station. Mason's stomach clenched. Ms. Hale, I don't think that's a good idea. The team already resents. The team needs to get used to the fact that you're a consultant now, not just hospitality services. And that means sometimes you'll be in meetings with them. Victoria's tone left no room for argument. 9 a.m. Tuesday. Wear something nicer than your usual work clothes. She hung up before Mason could protest further. Tuesday morning, Mason dropped Ellie off at school wearing the one decent suit he still owned from his Goldman Sachs days. It was slightly too big now. He'd lost weight over the past 3 years, and the pants needed hemming, but it was better than showing up in his coffee station clothes. Ellie had stared at him that morning like he was a stranger. Why are you so fancy? I have a meeting at work. A coffee meeting? A different kind of meeting. She'd accepted this with a shrug and gone back to her cereal. Now Mason stood outside the executive conference room at 8:55 a.m., trying to calm his nerves. Through the glass wall, he could see people already gathering: Richard Wu, Judith Chen, David Kowalski, several others he recognized but didn't know by name. All of them in expensive suits, all of them looking like they belonged there. All of them looking at him through the glass like he definitely didn't. Mason took a deep breath and opened the door. The conversation stopped immediately. Everyone turned to stare at him, and for a moment Mason felt like he was back in high school, the new kid walking into the cafeteria with no idea where to sit. Then Victoria walked in behind him. Good, you're here. Everyone, you know Mason Reed. He'll be joining us for strategy meetings going forward in his capacity as risk consultant. She gestured to an empty chair. Mason, sit wherever you want. The only empty chair was next to Richard Wu. Mason sat down, acutely aware of the tension radiating from the man beside him. Victoria took her seat at the head of the table and opened her laptop. Let's get started. First item is the revised timeline for the algorithm launch. Richard, where are we? Richard cleared his throat, not looking at Mason. We've made the corrections based on the external review. The new launch date is March 15th, pending final testing. Good. Mason, anything else you want to flag before we commit to that date? Every eye in the room turned to Mason. He could feel their resentment, their skepticism, their certainty that he was about to say something that would delay the project even further. Mason looked down at the notes he'd prepared. The market reversal vulnerability I mentioned. I'd recommend stress testing that specifically before launch. Run it through some historical crash scenarios, see how it responds. Richard's jaw tightened. We already do stress testing as part of our standard protocol. I know, I'm suggesting additional testing focused specifically on rapid reversals. October 2008, August 2015, March 2020. See if the algorithm can handle those conditions without amplifying losses. That'll take at least another week, someone across the table said. Mason thought his name was Thomas, but he wasn't sure. Victoria looked at Richard. Can you have those tests done in a week? Richard looked like he wanted to argue, but he just nodded. Yeah, we can do it. Good. Next item. The meeting continued for another hour. Mason mostly stayed quiet, speaking up only when Victoria specifically asked for his input. Each time he did, he could feel the room's temperature drop a few degrees. When the meeting finally ended, people filed out quickly, not making eye contact with Mason. Richard was the last to leave, and he stopped next to Mason's chair. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Richard's voice was low enough that only Mason could hear. Playing the hero. Making us look bad. Mason met his eyes. I'm doing the job Victoria hired me to do. Same as you. No, not the same as me. Richard leaned closer. I earned my position. I have a PhD from MIT and 15 years of experience building trading systems. You have what? A community college degree and 3 years serving coffee. Actually, I have a master's from Columbia and 7 years analyzing risk before my wife died, Mason said quietly. But you're right that we're not the same. You build algorithms. I find the flaws in them. That's why Victoria needs both of us. Richard stared at him for a long moment, then walked out without another word. Mason sat alone in the conference room, his hands shaking slightly. He just stood up to a senior vice president of quantitative trading. He'd just claimed a seat at a table he'd been invisible beside for 14 months. He had no idea if that was brave or stupid. Victoria poked her head back into the room. You okay? Yeah, fine. Richard's an ass when his ego gets bruised. Don't take it personally. Little late for that. Victoria came fully into the room and closed the door behind her. Mason, I need you to understand something. What you're doing here matters, not just because you caught one error, but because you see things differently than the people who've been staring at the same problems for years. That perspective is valuable. That's why I hired you. Your team doesn't see it that way. They will. Eventually. Victoria leaned against the table. In the meantime, you need to hold your ground. Because if you back down now, if you let Richard intimidate you into being invisible again, then you're not useful to me anymore. Understand? Mason understood. He just wasn't sure he could do what she was asking, but he nodded anyway. Because $15,000 a month meant Ellie could have new shoes and a bedroom that didn't have water stains on the ceiling. It meant he could pay his rent on time and maybe even save for her college fund. It meant he couldn't afford to be invisible anymore, no matter how much easier that would be. The algorithm went live on March 15th at exactly 9:30 a.m., 30 seconds after the market opened. Mason stood at the coffee station on the third floor, wiping down counters that didn't need wiping, trying not to think about the fact that 60 floors above him, millions of dollars were being traded based on code he'd spent the last 3 weeks reviewing. Richard's team had completed the additional stress testing. They'd fixed the market reversal vulnerability. They'd addressed every issue Mason had flagged in his reports. But that didn't stop his stomach from churning. At 10:15, his phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. Algorithm performing perfectly. Exactly as predicted. Nice work. Mason let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The rest of March passed in a blur of double shifts. Coffee station during the day, consulting work at night after Ellie went to sleep. Mason reviewed risk models, spot-checked trading algorithms, analyzed portfolio positions for potential vulnerabilities. Some nights he worked until 2 in the morning, his eyes burning from staring at spreadsheets, his back aching from hunching over his laptop at the kitchen table. But the first consulting payment hit his bank account on April 1st, and Mason sat at that same kitchen table staring at the balance like it might disappear if he looked away. $15,000. More money than he'd seen in one place since Sarah died. He paid off his back rent that afternoon. Bought Ellie 3 new pairs of shoes and a winter coat that actually fit. Went to the grocery store and bought fresh vegetables instead of the wilted ones from the discount bin. Small things. Normal things. Things other people took for granted. Things that felt like winning the lottery. Ellie noticed the changes immediately. "Why do we have the good peanut butter?" she asked one morning, holding up the jar like it was evidence of a crime. "Because we can afford it now." "Did you get a raise at the coffee job?" Something like that. She'd accepted this explanation the way 7-year-olds accept most things, with a shrug and a return to whatever was actually important, which in this case was building a volcano that would erupt bigger than Emma's. They spent 2 weekends in April constructing that volcano. Mason helped her build the structure out of cardboard and paper mache, watched her paint it with more enthusiasm than precision, mixed the baking soda and vinegar solution that would create the eruption. The night before the science fair, Ellie was so excited she could barely sleep. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked from her bed, her stuffed elephant clutched tight. "It'll work. We tested it 3 times, remember?" "What if it works too well, and it erupts all over the gym floor?" Mason smiled and brushed the hair back from her forehead. "Then we'll clean it up together. Either way, it's going to be great." The science fair was on a Thursday afternoon. Mason requested the time off from hospitality services, his first time ever asking to leave early, and showed up at PS 234 at 1 p.m. in his work clothes, still smelling faintly of coffee. The gymnasium was packed with parents and projects. Mason spotted Ellie's volcano immediately, sitting on a table near the back, painted in bright reds and oranges that definitely didn't match any volcano in nature, but looked exactly like something a 7-year-old would create. Ellie saw him and came running. "Daddy, you came!" "Of course I came. Wouldn't miss this." He looked at the volcano, currently dormant. "You ready for the eruption?" "Mrs. Patterson said we can do it at 2 o'clock. All the volcanoes erupt at the same time." They waited together, Ellie nervously rearranging the information poster she'd made about volcanic activity and plate tectonics. Mason read it and felt a surge of pride at how much she'd learned, how thoroughly she'd researched, how seriously she'd taken the whole project. At 2 o'clock, Mrs. Patterson gave the signal. Ellie poured the vinegar solution into the volcano's crater, and Mason held his breath. The eruption was perfect. Not too big, not too small. The red-dyed foam bubbling up and cascading down the sides exactly the way they'd planned. Ellie's face lit up with pure joy, and Mason thought that this moment right here was worth more than any consulting fee. Emma's volcano erupted 3 seconds later with significantly less impressive results, and Ellie tried very hard not to look smug about it. Afterward, as they walked back to the subway, Ellie held the small ribbon she'd won for most enthusiastic presentation and chattered about how next year she wanted to do something even bigger, maybe something with electricity or robotics. "We'll figure it out," Mason told her. "Whatever you want to do, we'll make it work." His phone buzzed, a text from Victoria. "Need you in the office tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., conference room, emergency." Mason's good mood evaporated instantly. He typed back, "What kind of emergency?" "The algorithmic kind. Can you make it?" Mason thought about his morning routine, about dropping Ellie at school, about the fact that 8 a.m. meant he'd have to leave his apartment by 6:30 at the latest. "I'll be there." That night, after Ellie was asleep, Mason tried to prepare himself for whatever crisis was waiting. He pulled up the algorithm files on his laptop, reviewed his previous notes, looked for anything that might have gone wrong in the 3 weeks since launch. But the algorithm had been performing flawlessly. Every metric looked good. Every stress test had passed. So what had changed? He didn't sleep well. At 4:45 a.m., he gave up and got out of bed, made coffee in the dark, stared at the numbers on his laptop screen until they started to blur together. Ellie woke up early again, padding into the kitchen at 5:30 with her elephant and her sleepy face. "Another big work day?" "Yeah, baby, another big work day." She climbed onto his lap, something she'd been doing less and less lately, and leaned against his chest. "You're doing the math job now, right? Not just the coffee job?" "Both jobs. Why do you ask?" "Because you look worried the way you used to look before Mom died. When you had the old job that made you tired all the time." Mason felt his chest tighten. He wrapped his arms around Ellie and held her close. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just trying to solve a problem for work. It's nothing bad. Promise?" "I promise." They sat like that for a long moment, father and daughter in a kitchen that was slowly getting lighter as dawn crept through the window. Finally, Ellie pulled back and looked at him seriously. "I like the good peanut butter and my new shoes, but I liked it before too, when it was just us and the cheap stuff." Mason had to swallow hard before he could speak. "Me too, Ellie Belly. Me too." He dropped her at school at 6:45, earlier than the early drop-off usually started, but Angela was already there and agreed to let Ellie wait in the cafeteria. Then Mason took the subway to Manhattan, his mind running through every possible crisis scenario. The conference room on the 62nd floor was already full when Mason arrived at 7:55. Victoria sat at the head of the table looking like she hadn't slept. Richard Wu was there, along with Judith Chen and David Kowalski and 3 other executives Mason recognized from previous meetings. All of them looked grim. Mason took the only empty seat next to a woman he didn't know who barely glanced at him. Victoria started talking immediately. "Thank you all for coming in early. We have a situation. Richard, walk everyone through it." Richard pulled up a presentation on the main screen. At approximately 11:47 p.m. last night, our algorithm detected an anomaly in overnight futures trading, specifically an unusual correlation spike between tech sector volatility and treasury yields. Mason leaned forward, studying the chart Richard had displayed. The correlation spike was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. "The algorithm responded according to protocol," Richard continued. "It reduced our tech exposure and increased our position in defensive sectors. Standard risk management procedure." "So what's the problem?" Judith asked. "The problem is that the anomaly disappeared by 2 a.m. The correlation returned to normal levels, which suggests this was either a data glitch or a temporary market inefficiency." Richard clicked to the next slide. "But the algorithm had already executed the trades. We're now holding positions that don't align with current market conditions." David leaned back in his chair. "How much are we talking?" $7 million in overnight trading activity. Not catastrophic, but not ideal either." Richard looked directly at Mason. "I wanted to reverse the trades at 2 a.m. when the anomaly cleared, but the algorithm's decision tree doesn't allow for position reversals within a 12-hour window. That's one of the constraints we built in to prevent overtrading. Everyone turned to look at Mason. He met their eyes, confused. I didn't design that constraint. That's part of your original architecture. But you reviewed the architecture, Richard said. You reviewed every aspect of this algorithm. If the 12-hour constraint was a flaw, why didn't you flag it? Mason felt the trap closing around him. The 12-hour constraint isn't a flaw. It's a reasonable safeguard against reactive trading. The real question is whether your anomaly detection system is too sensitive. My anomaly detection system, Richard said slowly, has been running successfully for 8 months without a single false positive. Until last night. Until last night. Richard's expression was carefully neutral, but Mason could see the accusation lurking beneath it. Which raises the question of whether something changed in the algorithm that affected how it interprets anomalies. The room went very quiet. Victoria looked between Mason and Richard. Are you suggesting that one of Mason's corrections caused this? I'm suggesting that we made significant changes to the algorithm based on an external review, and now we're seeing behavior we didn't see during testing. Richard pulled up another slide showing the algorithm's trading history. Before Mason's corrections, the algorithm never responded to correlation spikes smaller than 0.7%. Last night's spike was 0.43%, well below our historical threshold. Mason studied the data, his mind racing. Richard was right. The sensitivity had changed. But why? Then he saw it. The market reversal vulnerability he'd flagged. Richard's team had fixed it by adjusting the algorithm's volatility interpretation parameters. But in doing so, they'd inadvertently lowered the threshold for what the algorithm considered significant correlation changes. It's not the 12-hour constraint, Mason said quietly. And it's not a false positive. The algorithm is working exactly as designed. The problem is that when you fix the market reversal vulnerability, you increase the algorithm's sensitivity to correlation changes. It's now detecting smaller anomalies that your original version would have ignored. Richard's face went red. That's not... You tested it against historical crash scenarios. October 2008, August 2015, March 2020. Big events with clear correlation shifts. Mason pulled out his phone and opened his notes from the review. But you didn't test it against normal market noise, small temporary anomalies that resolved themselves within hours. Victoria leaned forward. Is that true, Richard? Richard looked like he wanted to argue, but he couldn't. The testing protocol focused on extreme scenarios. That's what Mason recommended. I recommended stress testing the market reversal fix, Mason said. I didn't recommend ignoring normal volatility testing. The conference room erupted in overlapping voices. Judith was demanding to know why normal volatility hadn't been part of the testing protocol. David was arguing that 7 million in misaligned positions wasn't actually that bad. The woman Mason didn't know was typing rapidly on her laptop, presumably calculating their exposure. Victoria held up her hand and the room went quiet. Okay, here's what we're going to do. Richard, I want a full analysis of the algorithm's sensitivity thresholds by end of day. Mason, I want you to review his analysis and recommend adjustments. We're going to recalibrate this system so it can distinguish between real anomalies and market noise. That could take weeks, Richard said. Then you'd better get started. Victoria's voice was ice. And Richard, next time we're testing a major fix, I want comprehensive testing across all scenarios, not just the dramatic ones. Clear? Crystal clear. Victoria dismissed the meeting, and people filed out in tense silence. Mason stayed in his seat, staring at the data still displayed on the screen, trying to figure out how he'd missed this. He should have caught it, should have realized that fixing one vulnerability might create sensitivity issues elsewhere, should have recommended broader testing instead of just focusing on extreme scenarios. Victoria sat down next to him after everyone else had left. Stop it. Stop what? Stop blaming yourself. This isn't your fault. I reviewed the algorithm. I signed off on the testing protocol. If you'd been more thorough, you would have found different issues, and Richard would be blaming you for those instead. Victoria rubbed her temples. This is how it works, Mason. We find problems, we fix them. We find new problems, we fix those. It's iterative. Nobody gets it perfect the first time. $7 million isn't perfect. $7 million isn't catastrophic either. We'll unwind the positions, recalibrate the system, and move on. She looked at him seriously. But I need you to understand something. Richard is looking for a reason to discredit you. He's looking for proof that the coffee guy doesn't know what he's doing, so you cannot give him ammunition by acting like you're not qualified to be here. Mason met her eyes. What if he's right? What if I'm not qualified? You caught an error that would have cost us $90 million. You found vulnerabilities in 3 other trading systems since then. You just identified the exact cause of last night's anomaly in under 5 minutes. Victoria stood up. You're qualified, Mason. You just need to start believing it. She left him alone in the conference room with those words echoing in his head. Mason spent the rest of the day at the coffee station, going through the motions while his mind worked on the sensitivity problem. Between pouring cups and restocking supplies, he sketched out potential solutions in his spiral notebook. The fix itself wasn't complicated. They just needed to adjust the correlation threshold parameters to filter out smaller anomalies. But implementing it without breaking something else would require careful testing. At 2:30, he left for Ellie's school, same as always. She came running out at 3, carrying a drawing she'd made during art class. "It's our volcano," she announced proudly. "Mrs. Patterson said I could bring it home." Mason looked at the drawing, a bright red mountain with orange lava and small stick figures standing nearby. "That's beautiful, sweetheart. We'll put it on the fridge." The tall fridge or the short fridge? They only had one fridge, and it definitely wasn't tall. What? Emma said her house has 2 fridges, a tall one in the kitchen and a short one in the garage. Ellie looked up at him. "Can we get another fridge?" Mason thought about the consulting money sitting in his bank account, about the fact that, yes, technically, they could now afford a second refrigerator, but that wasn't the point. "We don't need 2 fridges, baby. We barely fill the one we have." "Oh, okay." Ellie accepted this without argument and went back to admiring her volcano drawing. That night, after dinner and homework and the bedtime routine, Mason opened his laptop and found an email from Richard with the sensitivity analysis Victoria had requested. It was thorough, professional, and completely wrong. Richard had recommended increasing the correlation threshold from 0.43% to 0.85%. That would filter out the small anomalies, sure, but it would also make the algorithm too slow to respond to real threats. By the time a correlation shift hit 0.85%, it might already be too late to effectively hedge the position. Mason spent 3 hours working through alternative solutions. The correct threshold was probably around 0.6%, high enough to ignore market noise, low enough to catch genuine anomalies before they became problems. But he needed to test it against historical data to be sure. He pulled up the last 5 years of overnight trading data and started running simulations. At 0.6%, the algorithm would have ignored last night's anomaly, but would have responded appropriately to 17 legitimate correlation shifts. At Richard's suggested 0.85%, it would have missed 6 of those legitimate shifts. Mason documented everything in a detailed email to Victoria, including charts showing the simulation results and his recommendation for the 0.6 threshold. He sent it at 11:47 p.m., exactly 24 hours after the anomaly had first appeared. Victoria responded 3 minutes later. "This is excellent work. Forwarding to Richard now. Get some sleep." Sleep didn't come easy. Mason lay on his futon thinking about Richard's face during the meeting, about the accusation that Mason's corrections had caused the problem, about the fact that in some ways Richard was right. The algorithm's increased sensitivity was a direct result of fixing the market reversal vulnerability. But that didn't make the fix wrong. It just meant they needed to refine it. His phone buzzed at 6:15 a.m. while he was making breakfast. A text from Richard. "Your threshold recommendation is too aggressive. We need to discuss this in person before presenting to Victoria." Mason stared at the message, trying to decode whether this was a genuine invitation to collaborate or another trap. Finally, he typed back, "I'm available after 3 p.m. any day this week." "I'm talking about now, before your shift starts." Mason glanced at Ellie, still sleepy-eyed and eating her cereal. "I can't. I have to get my daughter to school." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. "Fine. Tonight then. 6 p.m. my office." Mason hesitated. 6 p.m. meant rushing home from Ellie's school, making her a quick dinner, and leaving her alone in the apartment while he went back to Manhattan. They'd never done that before. He'd never left her alone. But maybe it was time to start figuring out how to make this work. Ellie was 7, almost 8, responsible for her age, and he'd only be gone for an hour, maybe 2. Okay, he typed. 6 p.m. He spent the whole day second-guessing that decision. Between coffee orders and small talk with executives who barely saw him, Mason's mind was on Ellie, on what could go wrong in the 2 hours he'd be gone, on whether he was making a terrible parenting decision for the sake of a job. At 3 o'clock, he picked Ellie up from school and took her straight home. He made spaghetti for dinner, her favorite, and sat her down at the kitchen table. Listen, sweetheart, I have to go back to the office tonight for a meeting, just for a little while. Ellie's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. At night? Yeah, I should be home by 8 o'clock, maybe earlier. Will I be here alone? Mason's chest tightened at the fear in her voice. Yeah, but just for a couple hours. You'll be okay. You can watch TV, work on homework, whatever you want, and you can call me anytime if you need anything. What if something bad happens? Nothing bad is going to happen, but if you get scared or if there's an emergency, you call 911 first, then you call me. Okay? Ellie pushed her spaghetti around her plate, not eating. I don't want you to go. I know, baby, but this is important for work, and you're a big girl now. I know you can handle this. She didn't look convinced, but she nodded. Mason left the apartment at 5:30, guilt eating him alive. He'd left emergency numbers on the counter, made sure Ellie knew how to lock the door behind him, checked the batteries in the smoke detector twice. He'd done everything he could think of to keep her safe, but he still felt like the worst father in the world. Richard's office on the 62nd floor looked different at 6 p.m. The sun was setting over Manhattan, casting long shadows through the glass walls. Richard sat at his desk with multiple monitors displaying different versions of the algorithm, his sleeves rolled up, his tie long since abandoned. You're late, he said without looking up. Mason checked his watch. 6:02. Sorry, subway was slow. Richard finally turned to face him. Let's cut through the bullshit, okay? You think my threshold recommendation is too conservative. I think yours is too aggressive. We need to find a middle ground before Victoria forces us to implement something neither of us believes in. It was the most honest Richard had been with him since this whole thing started. Mason pulled up a chair and sat down. Okay, what's your reasoning for 0.85? Safety margin. If we're going to make a mistake, I'd rather we miss an anomaly than respond to noise. Richard pulled up a chart. Your simulations show we'd miss 6 legitimate correlation shifts over 5 years. That's 1 miss per year, roughly. I can live with that if it means we avoid false positives. But those 6 misses could cost millions of dollars each. And responding to noise costs millions too, like it did 2 nights ago. Mason leaned back, thinking. What if we added a confirmation layer? The algorithm detects a correlation shift at 0.6%, but before it executes trades, it waits 30 minutes and checks again. If the anomaly is still present, it's probably real. If it's disappeared, it's noise. Richard frowned, considering this. That delays our response time. By 30 minutes, which matters in flash crash scenarios, but not in most normal market conditions. Flash crash scenarios are exactly what we're trying to protect against. Then we program an override. If the correlation shift exceeds 0.8%, your threshold, the algorithm bypasses the confirmation wait and responds immediately. Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring at the monitors. Then he started typing, pulling up code, running quick calculations. Mason watched him work, saw the exact moment when Richard realized the solution might actually work. That could work, Richard said slowly. We'd need to test it thoroughly, but the logic is sound. I can help with the testing. Richard looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since this whole thing had started. Why are you doing this? Doing what? Helping. After everything I've said to you, after the way I've treated you, why are you still trying to make this work? Mason thought about lying, about giving some professional answer about teamwork and company success, but he was too tired for that. Because I need this job, he said simply. I have a 7-year-old daughter who needs new shoes every 4 months and a science fair volcano and eventually college tuition. And this consulting work, it's the first time in 3 years that I felt like I might actually be able to give her those things. So yeah, I'm going to help, even if you hate me for it. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I don't hate you. Could have fooled me. I resent you. There's a difference. Richard turned back to his monitors. You made me look incompetent in front of Victoria. You exposed flaws in work I'd spent months perfecting. And you did it all while serving coffee like it was the easiest thing in the world. It wasn't easy. None of this has been easy. Maybe not. But you made it look easy. And that made me look worse. Richard pulled up a fresh spreadsheet. But you're right about the confirmation layer. It's a good solution, better than either of our original recommendations. They spent the next hour and a half working through the implementation details. By 7:45, they had a working prototype and a testing plan that would take the rest of the week to complete. Mason checked his phone. 2 missed calls from Ellie. His heart stopped. He called her back immediately. She answered on the first ring. "Daddy, when are you coming home?" Her voice was small, scared, and Mason felt guilt crash over him like a wave. "I'm leaving right now, baby. I'll be there in 45 minutes. Are you okay?" "Yeah, there was a weird noise outside the door, and I got scared." "Did you look through the peephole?" "Yeah, nobody was there." "Then it was probably just someone walking down the hallway. You're safe, sweetheart. I promise." Mason was already grabbing his coat, heading for the elevator. "I'm sorry I was gone so long. I'll be home soon." "Okay. Can you stay on the phone until you get here?" "Yeah, baby. I'm not hanging up." Mason rode the elevator down 62 floors with his phone pressed to his ear, listening to Ellie describe every detail of her evening. The homework she'd finished, the TV show she'd watched, the peanut butter sandwich she'd made for herself when she got hungry. By the time he walked through their apartment door at 8:35, she was crying. Mason dropped his bag and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, while she sobbed against his chest. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I know I'm a big girl. I'm sorry I got scared." "You don't have to be sorry. You never have to be sorry for being scared." Mason carried her to the futon and sat down with her in his lap, rocking her gently. "And you are a big girl. The biggest, bravest girl I know. I don't want you to go to night meetings anymore." "Okay, I won't, I promise." "Really?" "Really. If I need to meet with someone after hours, I'll do it from home, on video chat or whatever. But I won't leave you alone at night again." Ellie pulled back and looked at him with red, puffy eyes. "Is the math job making you go away more?" The question hit Mason harder than it should have. "No, sweetheart. The math job is flexible. I can do most of it from home, remember?" "But you just went to a meeting." "I did. And I shouldn't have. That was my mistake." Mason wiped the tears from her cheeks. "Listen to me. Nothing, no job, no amount of money, nothing is more important to me than you. You understand that?" Ellie nodded against his chest. They sat like that for a long time, father and daughter on a broken futon in a tiny apartment, holding each other while the city hummed outside their window. Eventually, Ellie's breathing steadied, her grip on his shirt loosened, and Mason realized she'd fallen asleep. He carried her to her bed, tucked her in with her elephant, and stood in the doorway watching her sleep. 7 years old, still so small, still needing him in ways that no consulting fee could ever compensate for. His phone buzzed quietly. A text from Richard. "Prototype testing looks good. I'll present our joint solution to Victoria tomorrow. Credit to both of us." Mason read the message twice, then pocketed his phone without responding. Tomorrow he'd go back to Sterling Crown Capital and make coffee and attend meetings and help Richard implement their confirmation layer fix. Tomorrow he'd be the consultant who saved the company $90 million and the coffee guy who knew his place and the single father who somehow managed to be both. But tonight, he was just Ellie's dad. And that was enough. That was everything. Mason woke up at 4:47 a.m. the next morning to find Ellie standing next to the futon, her elephant tucked under one arm. "Can I sleep here with you?" Her voice was small in the dark. He didn't ask why, just pulled back the blanket and made room for her, and she crawled in beside him, curling into the space where Sarah used to sleep. Mason wrapped his arm around his daughter and felt her breathing slowly settle into the rhythm of sleep. He didn't sleep again after that, just lay there watching the water stain on the ceiling gradually become visible as dawn crept into the apartment, thinking about the fact that his attempt to balance everything had left his 7-year-old daughter terrified and alone. The consulting money didn't feel quite so much like winning the lottery anymore. At 7:30, Mason stood at the coffee station on the 3rd floor, measuring grounds with hands that felt heavier than usual. Richard's presentation to Victoria was scheduled for 9 o'clock. their joint solution to the sensitivity problem. Credit to both of us, Richard had said. But Mason kept thinking about Ellie's tear-stained face, about the promise he'd made to never leave her alone at night again, about the fact that consulting work meant late meetings and emergency calls and demands on his time that didn't care about bedtime routines and scared little girls. Victoria appeared at the coffee station at 8:15, earlier than usual. She took a cup of dark roast and stood there for a moment, not drinking it. "Richard sent me your joint proposal last night. The confirmation layer is brilliant. Thanks. You okay? You look like you didn't sleep." Mason poured cream into a cup for David Kowalski, who grabbed it without acknowledgement and walked away. "Just a long night." Victoria studied him with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Want to talk about it?" "Not really." "Fair enough." She took a sip of her coffee. "Listen, I know this has been a difficult transition. The consulting work on top of your regular hours, the tension with Richard's team, the fact that you're trying to raise a daughter while managing all of this. I'm handling it." "Are you?" Victoria's voice wasn't unkind, just direct. "Because from where I'm standing, you look like someone who's trying to be in 3 places at once and succeeding at none of them." Mason set down the coffee pot and met her eyes. "What do you want me to say? That this is harder than I thought? That I'm not sure I can keep doing both jobs? Yeah, it's hard, but I need the money, and I'm good at the work, so I'm making it work." "At what cost?" The question hung in the air between them. Mason thought about Ellie crying in his arms, about the guilt that had kept him awake all night, about the fact that he'd spent 3 years building a simple, stable life for his daughter, and was now systematically dismantling it for a paycheck. "I left Ellie alone last night," he said quietly, "for the first time ever. She was terrified. Called me twice, crying because she heard a noise in the hallway." Victoria's expression softened. "Mason, I promised her I wouldn't do it again, promised I'd handle everything from home from now on." He picked up the coffee pot again, needing something to do with his hands. "So I guess the answer to your question is, yeah, I'm handling it, but barely." Victoria was quiet for a moment, her coffee cooling in her hands. Then she said, "What if you didn't have to handle both jobs?" Mason looked up sharply. "Are you firing me?" "No, I'm offering you a choice." Victoria set down her cup. "Full-time risk consultant, 40 hours a week, flexible schedule, work from home whenever you need to. Salary equivalent to what you'd make on the hourly rate, plus benefits. You'd report directly to me, not Richard, and your hours would be entirely your own as long as the work gets done." Mason's brain stuttered trying to process this. "You're offering me a salaried position. I'm offering you a career, the one you should have had 3 years ago if life hadn't gotten in the way." Victoria picked up her coffee again. "You're wasted at a coffee station, Mason. You know it, I know it, everyone in this building knows it. So stop pretending you belong there and accept the fact that you belong in a conference room solving problems that matter. I can't just abandon hospitality services. They're short-staffed as it is. We'll hire someone else. That's not your problem. And the hours, I told you, flexible. You want to work from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. so you can pick up your daughter at 3? Fine. You want to split your day between morning and evening hours? Fine. You want to take Thursdays off for science fairs and parent-teacher conferences? Also fine." Victoria leaned against the counter. "The only requirement is that you're available for genuine emergencies, and those are rare. Everything else can be scheduled around your daughter." Mason stared at her, trying to find the catch. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you saved my company. Because you're brilliant at what you do. And because watching you try to be 2 people at once is exhausting, and I'm not even the one doing it." Victoria checked her watch. "Think about it. But don't think too long. Richard's presentation is in 45 minutes, and I'd like to know whether I'm announcing a new senior risk consultant or just thanking the coffee guy for his part-time help." She walked away, leaving her half-finished coffee on the counter. Mason stood there in the empty hallway, surrounded by coffee cups and sugar packets, and the remains of the life he'd built after Sarah died. A simple life. A safe life. A life where he knew exactly what was expected of him and exactly when he'd be done so he could go home to his daughter. But Ellie's words from last night echoed in his head. "I like the good peanut butter and my new shoes, but I liked it before too." His phone buzzed. A text from Ellie. Sent from the school office phone they let kids use for emergencies. "Are you still coming at 3? Love you. Mason typed back immediately. I'll be there, I promise. Love you too. He stared at that message for a long moment. Then he untied his apron, folded it neatly, and set it on the counter next to Victoria's coffee cup. Some promises mattered more than safety. The presentation at 9 o'clock went exactly as Richard had outlined. The confirmation layer would solve the sensitivity problem without sacrificing response time. Testing would take another week, implementation another week after that. Victoria approved the plan immediately and thanked both Richard and Mason for their collaboration. But as the meeting was wrapping up, Victoria held up her hand. One more thing before everyone leaves. I'm making some organizational changes to how we handle risk assessment going forward. She looked directly at Mason. Effective immediately, Mason Reed will be joining Sterling Crown Capital as our senior risk consultant, reporting directly to me. He'll be reviewing all algorithmic trading systems, providing independent analysis on portfolio risk, and serving as a check on our quantitative models. The room went silent. Mason saw Richard's face cycle through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been respect. Judith Chen was nodding approvingly. David Kowalski looked annoyed, but David always looked annoyed. Mason will no longer be working in hospitality services, Victoria continued. His focus will be entirely on risk analysis, and he'll be working a flexible schedule to accommodate his responsibilities as a single parent. I expect everyone in this room to extend him the same professional courtesy you'd extend to any senior consultant. Questions? Nobody had questions. Or at least nobody was willing to voice them. After the meeting, Richard caught up with Mason in the hallway. Senior risk consultant. Richard's expression was unreadable. That's a bigger title than I expected. Yeah, well, I didn't expect it either. You earned it. Richard extended his hand. I'm sorry for how I treated you. The things I said, they were unprofessional and unfair. Mason shook his hand, surprised by the apology. You weren't entirely wrong. I did make you look bad. No, you made me be better. There's a difference. Richard let go and shoved his hands in his pockets. For what it's worth, I'm glad you're staying. The confirmation layer solution. I never would have thought of that on my own. I was too focused on being right to consider alternatives. We both were. Richard smiled slightly. Yeah, we both were. Mason spent the rest of the day in a borrowed office on the 61st floor, setting up his new workspace and trying to wrap his head around the fact that this was real. He had business cards now, a direct phone line, a salary that meant Ellie could have the good peanut butter and new shoes and maybe even a second refrigerator if she really wanted one. But more importantly, he had a schedule that meant he could be at her school at 3 o'clock every single day without exception. At 2:45, Mason packed up his laptop and headed for the subway. His first day as senior risk consultant, and he was leaving at the same time he always had. Some things didn't need to change. Ellie was waiting outside her classroom at 2:58, same as always. But when she saw Mason, her entire face lit up in a way that made his chest ache. Daddy, you came! Of course I came. I always come. I know, but... Ellie threw her arms around him. I thought maybe with your new job you'd be too busy. Mason knelt down and looked at her seriously. Listen to me, Ellie Belly. I don't care what job I have or how important the work is. I will always be here at 3 o'clock. That's a promise I'm never going to break. Understand? Even if there's an emergency? Even then, I'll figure it out. But I will be here. Ellie hugged him again, tighter this time, and Mason held his daughter in the hallway of PS 234 and felt something settle in his chest. This was right. This was what mattered. They walked to the subway together, Ellie telling him about her day, about the book they'd read in class, about how she'd helped another kid with their math homework, about the announcement that next month they'd be starting a unit on space exploration. Can we go to the planetarium? Ellie asked as they boarded the train. Mrs. Patterson said there's a new show about black holes. Mason thought about his new salary, about the fact that yes, they could absolutely afford planetarium tickets now. Yeah, baby, we can go this weekend if you want. Really? Really? Ellie grinned and pulled out a book from her backpack, settling in against his shoulder to read while the train carried them home. That weekend, they went to the planetarium. Mason bought tickets to the black hole show and watched Ellie's face light up as the narrator explained gravitational forces and event horizons, and the way time itself bent near massive objects. Afterward, in the gift shop, Ellie spent 20 minutes debating between a book about space and a poster of the solar system before deciding on both. Are you sure we can afford it? She asked, clutching the items to her chest. Yeah, sweetheart, we can afford it. In the checkout line, a woman behind them smiled at Ellie. Interested in space? I love space. Did you know that if you fell into a black hole, time would slow down for you, but everyone else would see you freeze? The woman laughed. I did not know that. You must be very smart. My daddy's smart too. He does math for a really important company. He used to just make coffee, but now he helps them not lose money. Mason felt his face flush, but the woman just smiled at him. Sounds like you have a lot to be proud of. I do, Mason said, looking down at Ellie. I really do. Over the following weeks, Mason settled into his new role at Sterling Crown Capital. He reviewed risk models from home most mornings, attended video conferences while Ellie did her homework at the kitchen table, and only went into the office when absolutely necessary. The algorithm launched successfully on April 1st with the new confirmation layer in place and performed flawlessly through the rest of the month. But the biggest change wasn't in Mason's work. It was in Victoria. She started asking questions during meetings, not just about numbers and models, but about the people behind them. She remembered birthdays. She learned the names of the security guards and the cafeteria workers. She stopped at the new coffee station attendant, a guy named Marcus who'd been hired to replace Mason, and actually asked him how his day was going. One afternoon in early May, Victoria stopped by Mason's office. Got a minute? Sure, what's up? Victoria closed the door and sat down across from him. I wanted to thank you. Mason set down the report he'd been reviewing. For what? For reminding me that people are more important than positions, that someone's value isn't determined by their job title. She looked out the window at Manhattan stretching below them. I've been running this company for 3 years, and somewhere along the way, I forgot that. I started seeing people as functions instead of human beings. Executives, analysts, coffee service, just roles to fill. You were just focused on the business. I was being an asshole. Victoria turned back to him. You know what changed my mind? It wasn't the fact that you caught the algorithm error. It was watching you choose your daughter over a meeting, watching you set boundaries and stick to them, even when it would have been easier to compromise, watching you refuse to sacrifice the things that actually mattered for the things that just seemed important. Mason didn't know what to say to that. I grew up thinking success meant working 80-hour weeks and sacrificing everything for your career, Victoria continued. My father built his company that way, missed my childhood, missed my mother's cancer treatment, missed everything that wasn't directly related to making money, and I was following the same path without even realizing it. And now? Now I'm trying something different. I'm trying to build a company where people don't have to choose between their jobs and their lives, where single parents can leave at 3 o'clock to pick up their kids, where success doesn't require sacrificing everything else. Victoria smiled slightly. I don't know if it'll work, but I figure if you can do it, maybe the rest of us can too. 2 weeks later, Sterling Crown Capital announced a new flexible scheduling policy for all employees. Parents could adjust their hours around school schedules. Remote work was encouraged when feasible. The company even opened an on-site childcare facility for employees who needed it. Richard Wu was the first person in his department to take advantage of the policy, adjusting his schedule so he could coach his son's Little League team on Wednesday afternoons. Judith Chen started leaving at 4 instead of 7, spending evenings with her aging mother instead of staring at trading screens. Even David Kowalski, perpetually annoyed David, started taking Fridays off to pursue the photography hobby he'd abandoned 15 years ago. The company didn't collapse. Productivity didn't plummet. If anything, people worked harder during the hours they were there because they knew they had permission to have lives outside the office. It wasn't perfect. There were still crisis moments that required long hours and sacrifice. There were still tensions and disagreements and the normal friction of any workplace. But it was better, and better was enough. One evening in late June, Mason was helping Ellie with a math worksheet at the kitchen table when his phone rang. An unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Is this Mason Reed? A woman's voice, professional but warm. Yes? Who's this? My name is Jennifer Santos. I'm a recruiter for Hoffman Strategic Partners. I got your name from a colleague who said you're doing excellent risk analysis work at Sterling Crown. We're looking for a chief risk officer, and I wanted to see if you'd be interested in interviewing. Mason's first instinct was to say no. He had a good job, a flexible schedule, A life that finally felt stable, but curiosity got the better of him. What kind of salary are we talking about? Jennifer named a number that made Mason's head spin. Nearly triple what he was making now, plus stock options, plus bonuses, plus benefits that included full tuition coverage for dependents. That's a generous offer, Mason said carefully. But I have specific requirements around my schedule. I have a daughter, and I need to be available for her. We're aware. That's actually part of why we're interested. We're trying to build a more family-friendly culture, and we need leaders who can model that. Jennifer paused. I'm not asking for an answer now. Just think about it. I'll email you the full details, and you can let me know if you want to move forward. Mason thanked her and hung up. He sat there staring at his phone, trying to process the fact that he'd just been headhunted for a C-level position. Who was that? Ellie asked, looking up from her worksheet. Someone offering me a different job. Are you going to take it? I don't know. What do you think? Ellie considered this seriously. Will you still be able to pick me up at 3 o'clock? Yeah, that's non-negotiable. Then I think you should do whatever makes you happy. Mason smiled and pulled her into a hug. When did you get so wise? I've always been wise. You just weren't paying attention. That night, after Ellie was asleep, Mason sat at the kitchen table with his spiral notebook and made a list of pros and cons. More money, better benefits, a chance to shape risk management practices at a major firm, but also more responsibility, more pressure, and the risk that the flexible schedule promises wouldn't survive the realities of a C-level role. He was still debating when his phone buzzed, a text from Victoria. Heard you got a call from Hoffman. Want to talk about it? Mason typed back, Shay, how did you hear about that already? Jennifer Santos and I go way back. She called to ask if I'd give you a reference. I told her you were the best risk analyst I'd ever worked with, and if she tried to steal you, I'd never speak to her again. Mason smiled despite himself. And she said she was stealing you anyway because that's how good you are. I haven't said yes. But you're thinking about it. Mason stared at his phone, not sure how to respond. Finally, he typed, Yeah, I'm thinking about it. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Mason, I'm not going to pretend I don't want you to stay. You've made Sterling Crown better just by being here. But if Hoffman can offer you something I can't, something that's better for you and Ellie, then you should take it. You've spent 3 years putting everyone else first. Maybe it's time to put yourself first for once. Mason read the message 3 times. Then he set down his phone and looked around the tiny kitchen with its chipped counters and flickering light. He'd lived here for 3 years, building a small, safe life for his daughter. And it had been enough. But maybe enough wasn't the same thing as everything they deserved. He called Jennifer Santos back the next morning and agreed to interview. The interview process took 2 weeks. Mason met with the CEO, the board of directors, the entire executive team. He presented his analysis of their current risk management practices and outlined how he'd improve them. He negotiated salary, benefits, schedule flexibility, and a written guarantee that he could leave by 2:30 every day to pick up his daughter. They offered him the position on July 15th, Chief Risk Officer, $240,000 a year, stock options that could be worth significantly more, and a promise that family would always come first. Mason accepted. His last day at Sterling Crown Capital was July 31st. Victoria insisted on throwing him a goodbye party in the executive conference room, complete with cake and speeches and a plaque thanking him for his service. Richard shook his hand and said, You're going to be great at this. Just remember to occasionally let other people be right too. Judith Chen hugged him and said, Don't be a stranger. We'll need you to consult on the impossible problems. Even David Kowalski managed something that resembled a smile and said, Good luck, you'll need it. But it was Victoria's goodbye that hit hardest. She pulled Mason aside after the party, away from everyone else. You changed this company, she said quietly, not just with your analysis. You changed how we think about success, about balance, about what actually matters. And you changed me. I just did my job. No, you did more than that. You showed us that being excellent at work and being present for your family aren't mutually exclusive, that you can be brilliant and kind, that success doesn't require sacrificing everything else. Victoria's eyes were bright. Thank you for that. Mason didn't trust himself to speak, so he just hugged her. On his way out, Mason stopped by the third-floor coffee station. Marcus was there, restocking supplies, doing the same job Mason had done for 14 months. "Hey," Mason said. "Just wanted to say goodbye." Marcus looked up. "You're the guy who used to work here, right? Before you became some big-shot consultant." "That's me. Must be nice. Moving up like that." Mason thought about the journey from coffee station to consultant to chief risk officer. About the nights he'd spent hunched over his laptop while Ellie slept. About the fear and doubt and the constant feeling that he was failing at everything. "It wasn't easy," he said honestly. "And there were a lot of times I wasn't sure it was worth it. But yeah, it worked out." Marcus nodded. "Good for you, man. Seriously." Mason left Sterling Crown Capital for the last time and took the subway to Queens, same as he'd done hundreds of times before. But this time felt different. This time he wasn't going home to a broken futon and a water-stained ceiling and the constant worry about making rent. This time he was going home to start packing for the new apartment he'd rented in a better neighborhood with a real bedroom for Ellie and an office where he could work without spreading papers across the kitchen table. Ellie was waiting at PS 234 at 2:58, same as always. But today she had a surprise. "Mrs. Patterson said I can skip a grade." She was practically vibrating with excitement. "I can go straight to third grade instead of second grade because I'm ahead in math and reading." Mason picked her up and spun her around, not caring that she was getting too big for it. "That's amazing, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." "Are you proud of you too? For your new job?" Mason set her down and knelt to her level. "Yeah, baby, I think I am." "Good, because I'm proud of you too. Even when you were just making coffee, I was proud. But now you're helping a whole different company not lose money, which means you're even more important." "I wasn't just making coffee, Ellie. I was making sure you had everything you needed." "I know, and I did." She hugged him tight. "I always did." They walked to the subway together, Ellie chattering about third grade and all the new things she'd learn. Mason listened and asked questions and thought about how far they'd come since that morning when he'd stood in a stairwell trying to convince Victoria Hale that he was worth listening to. He'd been invisible then, the coffee guy nobody saw, the single father trying to build a safe life for his daughter out of the wreckage of the one he'd lost. But somewhere along the way, he'd become visible again, not because he'd demanded attention or forced his way into rooms where he didn't belong, but because he'd quietly done the work that needed doing, held his boundaries when it mattered, and refused to let anyone tell him that his value was determined by his job title. And in doing so, he'd shown other people, Victoria, Richard, Judith, David, everyone at Sterling Crown Capital, that they could do the same, that they could be excellent at their work and present for their lives, that success didn't require sacrifice, it just required knowing what actually mattered and refusing to compromise on it. 2 years later, Mason Reed stood in his office at Hoffman Strategic Partners, looking out at the Manhattan skyline, and thought about how strange life could be. He was chief risk officer now. He managed a team of 15 analysts. He advised billion-dollar investment decisions and sat in board meetings, and had an assistant who scheduled his appointments and filtered his emails. But every day at 2:30, he closed his laptop and left the office to pick up Ellie from school. Every evening, they had dinner together and talked about their days. Every weekend, they went to museums or parks, or just stayed home building increasingly elaborate science projects. And every month, without fail, Mason had lunch with Victoria Hale. She'd tell him about Sterling Crown's latest developments and ask his advice on impossible problems. He'd tell her about Hoffman's new initiatives and thank her again for taking a chance on the coffee guy. "You were never just the coffee guy," Victoria said during one of those lunches. "You were always the brilliant analyst who happened to be serving coffee. I just helped you remember that. You did more than that. You changed how I thought about what was possible." "No," Victoria said, smiling. "You did that. I just got out of your way." Mason's phone buzzed. A text from Ellie, now 9 years old and in 4th grade after skipping another year. "Don't forget, I have soccer practice until 5 today. Love you." Mason showed Victoria the text. "She's playing soccer now, can you believe it?" "I absolutely can. She's your daughter. Of course she's trying everything." They finished lunch and said their goodbyes, and Mason walked back to his office thinking about the drawing Ellie had made all those years ago, the one titled My Hero, that showed him standing behind a coffee counter with a notebook in one hand and her small hand in the other. He still had that drawing. It was framed on his office wall now, right next to his Columbia degree and his professional certifications and all the other markers of success that were supposed to prove he'd made it. But that drawing mattered more than all of them combined, because it captured the truth that Mason had taken 3 years to fully understand, that being a hero had nothing to do with job titles or salary or the size of your office. It had everything to do with showing up for the people who needed you, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. That evening, Mason picked up Ellie from soccer practice and listened to her describe in elaborate detail the goals she'd almost scored. They stopped for ice cream on the way home, sitting on a bench outside the shop while the summer sun set over the city. "Daddy?" Ellie said between bites of chocolate chip. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you miss it, making coffee?" Mason thought about the coffee station on the 3rd floor of Sterling Crown Capital, about the early mornings and the invisible hours and the executives who barely saw him, about the simplicity of that life, the way every day had been predictable and safe. "Sometimes," he admitted, "it was simpler then." "But not better?" "No, not better." Mason pulled Ellie closer. "This is better. All of this, the complicated job and the weird hours and the constant juggling, it's all better because we're building something together, a real life, not just a safe one." Ellie finished her ice cream and leaned against his shoulder. "I like our real life." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." They sat there as the sun finished setting, father and daughter, on a bench in Queens, surrounded by the noise and chaos and impossible beauty of New York City. Mason thought about the journey that had brought them here, from tragedy to survival to something that looked like actual thriving. It hadn't been smooth. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments when he'd wanted to quit, to go back to the safety of invisibility, to stop trying so hard. But he hadn't quit. He'd kept showing up, kept doing the work, kept putting Ellie first even when it would have been easier to compromise. And in the end, that had made all the difference. Not because it had earned him promotions or salary increases or fancy job titles, but because it had taught him something he'd forgotten in the years since Sarah died. That dignity wasn't something other people gave you. It was something you claimed for yourself by deciding what mattered and refusing to settle for less. He'd been the coffee guy nobody saw, the single father struggling to make rent, the invisible man serving executives who never looked twice. But he'd also been the analyst who saved Sterling Crown $90 million, the consultant who changed how an entire company thought about work-life balance, the father who never missed a 3 o'clock pickup no matter what. And now he was the chief risk officer who proved you could be excellent at your job and present for your daughter, who showed that success didn't require sacrifice, who lived proof that the person pouring your coffee might be the smartest person in the building if you just take the time to see them. Mason looked down at Ellie, drowsy and content against his shoulder, and felt a peace he hadn't felt in years. They'd made it, not to some perfect ending where everything was easy and nothing hurt, but to a place where the struggles felt worth it, where the victories, small and large, belonged to both of them. "Come on," he said, standing up and taking Ellie's hand. "Let's go home." And together, they walked into the summer evening, father and daughter, hand in hand, building a life that mattered more than any job title ever could, because in the end, that was the only success that counted.